listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, folks. Hope everybody's having a good one. It is October 6th. It is 2021. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern, and it's time now for headlines. Let's get into them. First up, in COVID stats. Yesterday in the United States, there were 98,506 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,808 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of just over 101,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 24% from the average of new cases 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 65% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,925,355 people across the United States. It has also killed 705,394 people here in the U.S. In national political news, Joe Biden has stated that the Democrats could change the filibuster rules in order to raise the debt ceiling. We'll come back to that. I thought that they didn't want to change the filibuster rules ever because of Joe Manchin, right?
Yes. Yeah. And Joe Biden didn't seem like he was all excited about the idea. But at this point, their issue is, well, you can't stick us with raising the debt ceiling on our own. Manchin is basically poo-pooed that idea right off the bat. It was like, yeah, that's not happening, and made the point about reconciliation. It's amazing how one man can basically tell the president, yeah, we're not doing that. Yeah. Kick rocks.
Yes. I hear you. Former White House Chief of Staff under Trump, Mark Meadows, and other top aides have been subpoenaed by the House committee looking into the January 6th riot. An inside source says that these people are planning to defy the order and refuse to surrender over documents and other files to the committee. President Biden told reporters yesterday that he had discussed Taiwan in his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping last month. He stated the two came to terms and, quote, will abide by the Taiwan agreement, end quote. This is referring to a long-standing diplomatic understanding that the U.S. recognizes Beijing as the sole legal government of China without clarifying the United States' position on Taiwan sovereignty. Yesterday, some 1,400 employees, 1,400 employees went on strike at Kellogg's cereal plants all over America. Union president accused the cereal company of, quote, demanding workers give up health care and retirement benefits and holiday and vacation pay, end quote. Kellogg spokesperson Chris Banner said the company offers benefits and compensation amongst the best in the industry. In Earth and Science news, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry has been given to Benjamin List and David McMillan for the development of the model of organocatalysis. Are basically, you'd have two types of catalysts previously. You'd have enzymes and then different metals. And catalysts are basically chemicals you can use with other chemicals to change the other chemicals.
What's to speed the chemical process up?
Yeah, basically. And but you can also use it not just to speed it, but just to do your own transformations. It's major in chemistry basically for creating new classes of chemicals or rare classes of chemicals. You know, you use chemicals in combinations with other chemicals basically. And previously you'd have enzymes, which are biological, of course. Our body creates them as they do living things in general. And you'd also have metals, which would be used, and they're basically created a sort of joint model. You can look up little diagrams. I don't understand it. I'm not pretending to understand it, but it's interesting to think there were two kinds of catalysts, basically, and they've created a new third one, sort of based on the principles of the previous two.
I mean, if you think about it, for us to be able to get certain materials and supplies and stuff like that, whether it's in space or whether it's in just kind of exotic materials, you may need stuff like that. Like, it may be stuff, you know, this kind of chemical wizardry that you use in order to create something else that never existed or doesn't necessarily exist in the natural world. So no, that's fascinating.
Yes, yeah. In the wake of the California oil spill this past weekend, California lawmakers are pushing to ban all offshore oil drillings. The spills dumped around 126,000 gallons of crude oil into the ocean. In business news, Saudi Aramco, the oil company, hit a $2 trillion valuation based mainly on rising oil prices. That puts Aramco just behind Microsoft and Apple as the world's most valuable company. In holiday news, it is today National German American Day. These are American holidays, of course. National Plus-Sized Appreciation Day. and National Transfer Money to Your Daughter Day. And with that, wait, hang on a second. Wait, what? With that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
National Transfer Money to Your Daughter Day?
Transfer Money to Your Daughter Day.
I thought I heard that wrong. That's what
No, you heard that absolutely correct, Jamarl. I'm sorry. I was struggling for a comment on that one. But that's a very specific and a little bit weird. I don't know. Isn't that gendered? Isn't that patriarchal, Jamarl?
I don't know. It just sounds funny. Totally funny. Transfer money to your daughter day. So is there a transfer money to your Sunday?
I gosh darn hope so. God.
Man, that's pretty wild. That's pretty wild. I've never heard of that one.
Yeah,
That's what I mean, man. It seems like we have far too much time on our hands.
That is in a week.
Days.
It's in a week. Thankfully, transfer money to your Sunday is October 13th.
Is that fair? How did they decide on the daughter going first?
I don't know, but I'm guessing because she goes first, it's like when you're divvying up portions. It's either like she takes most of it because you're just giving food out, in this case money, or
that's so funny.
I don't know, man.
That's funny.
And then there are a couple of other topics, including the prospect of war with China over Taiwan. I've been seeing people sort of rabble-rousing about that in different corners, saying that that's a possibility. Of course, these kinds of things will often come up as possibilities, and usually they just serve as useful material for the media.
Unfortunately, it's not just, yes, true, fair enough. But it's been getting seemingly increasingly more belligerent. I mean, China mounts largest incursion yet near Taiwan, blames the United States for tensions. There's the other one, Taiwan is preparing for war as China vows to crush Allen after deploying 129 fighters into its airspace. I mean, it's a few of these articles that have been kind of popping up over the last few days. China has sent over 800 flights towards Taiwan since Friday in a show of force. But keep in mind, it's towards Taiwan, and it's like just tiny incrementally, let's call it a freedom of navigation exercise that China is doing in the air, if we want to call it that. It's hard to know the reality of it, like the severity of that back and forth. But I would say that just like when Joe Biden couldn't predict Russia's behavior regarding the Ukraine, and Joe Biden was like, hey, we need to talk. Well, he just had a conversation with Xi Jinping on the Taiwan issue also. So maybe there was a reality to it where he's like, all right, this is getting out of control. We need to have a conversation on what's going on. But I'm not sure. I mean, he basically didn't deviate from Donald Trump's policy on either Iran or, for that matter, or Taiwan. So we will see.
I hear you. Well, and part of the thing, I mean, I wasn't in on the show on Monday, but I was listening to parts of it, including part of your interview with Carl Zhao, where you were, I believe this was on Monday. You were talking about the air, this might have been last week, actually. The air defense identification zone, where basically you have Taiwan, you have China.
I think that was Monday.
That might have been Monday.
Yeah, it was Monday.
Sure. But basically, you have Taiwan with its own air identification zone, where its planes are allowed to fly.
Unilateral, by the way.
And it stretches over quite a bit of China's territory. Yeah. If you look it up on a map, you'll see that a lot of where planes are allowed to fly in Taiwan, what Taiwan considers basically its airspace, is like over mainland China by quite a ways. In other words, into what I would consider their territory.
Imagine that for the moment. It's like my airspace is over top of Mexico. And it's like, and when I'm flying over that route, they're complaining about the fact that we're flying in our airspace. It would be like
if Cuba wanted to be able to fly their planes over most of Florida, for instance. And it was like, no, this is our zone. You can't fly your planes over Florida. That's at least how I took it.
That's how I took it too.
If I'm understanding the situation correctly, that's not a good situation.
That's not a good choice. It's just very bizarre.
It's setting you up for a war. It's like the people who were inventing this situation, not ironically, were very interested in using this as a potential casus belli in the future, a justification for war. Yeah. And like, okay, let's set up a trigger here at some point that we can fall back on. Does that make sense? I don't know if it
totally makes sense.
Tinfoil hat of me, but
I mean, if you're going to create something that you know is going to be a provocation, like if you step out your door, despite it being on your property, we're going to have issues, buddy.
Oh, yeah.
And it's basically, what we're talking about. And even then, I mean, I have a hard time seeing how the United States complains about this. The United States seems to come into these provocative actions in the South China Sea continuously. And they say these are freedom of navigation movements. That's all this is. This is not a provocation for conflict or anything else. We're not trying to get into any kind of larger conflict, just freedom of navigation. And when China is doing the same thing, all of a sudden there's outrage. Oh my God, I can't believe China is threatening Taiwan in this way. China does not consider Taiwan a sovereign country. That's the first point. And, this goes all the way back to the Second World War, where the communists basically won and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And for the longest time, Taiwan had been considered, or at the very least, there was this kind of weird back and forth over, okay, which one is the real China, despite the fact that China had the overwhelming majority of all of the landmass. But, one of the things that Jia said that I thought was interesting was if Taiwan let's say if Taiwan got to the point of declaring independence, that is basically a red line, and everything kicks off from that point. And there's this other interesting question of how many dead Americans are the United States military willing to risk in order to protect Taiwan? And that's assuming you could even protect Taiwan, considering how far it is away from our mainland and everything else that our military resources. I don't know. I mean, our policy needs to, it's just weird. Ellsberg made this point once before, after the release of the Pentagon Papers. He had also evidence talking about the U.S. military willing to potentially use nuclear weapons in the defense of Taiwan. Now, this was back, 60s or something like that. And his point was, has the policy of the U.S. in regards to China and Taiwan changed? We don't know. We have no idea. But there's all sorts of bellicosity around this very specific issue. We sell them all sorts of weapons, high priced apparently, but we definitely grift the devil out of them in regards to the weapons that we sell them. So I don't know, man. I mean, Taiwan, I have a hard time believing Taiwan could defend itself against China if China decides to take Taiwan.
If we didn't decide to intervene in a dramatic way, of course not. That's the whole thing there. But would China, mainland China, want to take Taiwan, retake Taiwan, however you want to look at it?
Yeah.
Would they want to do that militarily, or would that be a kind of Fabian victory for them? Because culturally, they're having to kill a lot of people that they're declaring their citizens, even though they're, waging a war against the government. You'd certainly have collateral damage.
Yeah.
And it's just that sets you up down a kind of bad road, unlike a diplomatic unification / annexation, whatever the hell that looks like. And I'm just speaking in the bluntest language, not trying to stir anything up, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If they decided to go that route and it were peaceable, then they might, that would be a victory.
Yes.
Just an unquestionable, okay, you got this thing peacefully, you've managed to reintegrate this territory.
Yeah.
That's a big win for you. A war, especially one that they choose to initiate with the question of U.S. involvement,
that
would be horrendous, and any victory there would be questionable. And so that's the thing, the stalemate. And of course, the longer Taiwan goes as an independent nation, albeit one that's only protected by U.S. Power in the region, I think two things come up. One, it's just more status quo, more time as an independent nation, more time without being unified with China, gives it more national sovereignty, it gives it more of this sense of cultural independence, that kind of thing.
Does it?
But,
because that's
on the other hand, maybe there's a ratcheting tension of I don't know, the inevitability of it, because it's not for me to say. I'm almost getting Hegelian here or something, where it seems something intrinsic about the historical process of this as a part of this larger cultural bloc, wanting to be reunified with it. But I'm saying, as time goes on, maybe it'll give them some independence, and that's part of the equation with time too, right?
I guess my thought is, is that true? I guess there's two ways you can look at it, right? Yeah. I'm not quite sure entirely which one is completely correct. You have this one thought that says, well, the longer the status quo goes on and China remains in the ascendancy, the better it is for China. If the United States is, let's say, becoming a brittle empire in this kind of way, and if the U.S. is kind of the main supplier and the main bolster of Taiwan, well, the further you go into the future, the weaker the U.S. gets and the stronger or more ascendant China gets, then it seems that undermines Taiwan's position in regards to being an independent nation.
Yes.
You invariably get to this kind of inflection point where the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to defend it, even if it wanted to defend it. And so there's that part. But there's the other part that's somewhat of a cultural thing. Like, the longer it remains quasi-independent, we can call it quasi-independent, the more claim it has to independence. I'm not sure which one of those things wins. Also, there's this other interesting question that I always hit my head on. At what point does a country gain independence? And when should it gain independence? When is that moment where it says, all right, that country is sufficiently different enough culturally that it should get independence, and the overwhelming majority of the country wants to be something else. So you get 90% of the population saying, no, we want to be our own thing. Is that insufficient for that country to claim independence? And what right does a larger body have of forcing that country to be part of the umbrella? Let's look at Nagorno-Karabakh, for example, where you would have many of the people there. They would say, this is Armenian territory. We should be part of Armenia, etc. And yet the rest of the world doesn't consider it that way. Even Hong Kong. Hong Kong may come out and says, okay, a large part of us wants to be independent. And China's like, yeah, nobody, that's not going to happen. At what point? Let's say Texas, as another example. If Texas, 90% of Texas, say we want to cede from the Union, should they be allowed to cede from the Union? At what point does self-determination take hold and allow I'll get, I don't know, a moral, ethical, a cosmic justification for that thing to be something separate and distinct? I have no idea what that answer is. And all sorts of wars are fought over that very specific question.
It's true. And then, you know what, if we back out for a second, and mainly this is, we need to go into our next segment, and this is another thing that comes to mind. Like the idea of Westphalian sovereignty and the idea that you have a single, a globe covered by unified nation states that are unto themselves whole entire, or something like that.
Yeah.
With the exception of a few larger blocks like the European Union that tie those nation states together and admittedly complicate things. But I think that's getting to the point. Like, is Westphalian sovereignty, the idea of a nation state as we've gotten used to it over the last couple hundred years, has that changed, or is that going to continue to change as A, free trade, B, corporatism, C, massive international trade and investment deals, and just this increasing enmeshment between whether it's state corporations, like say China keeps investing in the Horn of Africa, for instance. At what point should you consider China and the Horn of Africa a mixed block?
Because of the relationships, the economic relationships that these guys are engaging in.
The countries have factual and nominal independence from each other, and they do have independence politically, but the degree of economic integration is so tight between them at a certain point that, it starts to spill over, and it's not just one country. And maybe characteristically, historically, this has been done by individual colonial nations, and that might be the form in which some of this stuff takes place in the future is, okay, China keeps investing, China's state corporations keep investing in other things, that kind of thing, state-run corporations, whatever. That starts to look like a colonial empire at a certain point. But if you have multiple nations doing this at the same time, especially if you add in weird stuff like cryptocurrencies, it's just these bonds and the boundaries between nations. I'm wondering if that's going to change. I'm wondering if the lines of these things are going to slightly dissipate. Because I'll put it like this: if China and Taiwan remain, and this seems completely unrealistic to me, but I'm trying to put this out there as a toy model. If they were to remain more or less independent politically, but the trade ties between them were to grow so strong, and the U.S. were to just disappear into the distance militarily, we stopped trying to control this side of the Pacific, basically, that side of the Pacific, and we stepped back. Could you have some lasting settlement that everybody might be happy with, where Taiwan and China are formally separate, culturally united, economically deeply united, but politically they kind of have their own systems? Taiwan has more political, independence, and it's more individualistic, that kind of thing. I don't know, man. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We got to close it out. Admittedly, I was going a little bit long there.
No, you're fine. You're trying to make your point.
I'm trying to get out an idea of a possible future, because there have been signs of the whole Westphalian sovereignty thing going into decline for a long time, not least of which is that you've had several major unified global blocs,
right,
where instead of having a bunch of independent nations, factually, you've had the United States for like 70 years with all its allies and proxy groups, the Soviet Union with its allies and allies and proxies, and then a bunch of more or less independent nations that have to fall on one side or the other. You have these blocks. That's not Westphalian sovereignty. That's something completely different. So we're living on the other side of that era. I'm saying throw it all together. Maybe we'll see a major shakeup there. But hey,
or nation states take somewhat of a backseat to something
somewhat
else.
of a backseat to other different political, economic, and governmental models where bodies of laws instituted by the United Nations and enacted by the SCO, for instance, in that part of Asia. Those kinds of things. These, like, whether Taiwan and China are one nation, if they're tightly integrated in a trade bloc, for instance, might not be as important, and that might be an amicable way going forward. I'm just trying to throw this stuff out here. Anyway, let's go into a break. I want to come back in Jamarl's monologue, his soapbox segment. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones, with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So yesterday, we were afforded the opportunity to basically have Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, to basically give testimony to Congress. Some of this testimony was quite interesting, especially one of the interesting back and forths with Ted Cruz. But I'm going to go to her entry statement first, and we're going to keep Ted Cruz to the end, because that's the one that gets on censorship. And her answer to that is actually quite surprising and puts you more so in the mind of what Peter Coffin was saying yesterday about dealing with the algorithm as opposed to the specific information. So let's start off with the first clip. This is her basically opening from Congress.
Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Blackburn, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you. My name is Frances Haugen. I used to work at Facebook. I joined Facebook because I think Facebook has the potential to bring out the best in us. But I'm here today because I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. Congressional action is needed. They won't solve this crisis without your help. Yesterday, we saw Facebook get taken off the internet. I don't know why it went down, but I know that for more than 5 hours, Facebook wasn't used to deepen divides, destabilize democracies, and make young girls and women feel bad about their bodies. It also means that millions of small businesses weren't able to reach potential customers, and countless photos of new babies weren't joyously celebrated by family and friends around the world. I believe in the potential of Facebook. We can have social media we enjoy that connects us without tearing apart our democracy, putting our children in danger, and sowing ethnic violence around the world. We can do better. I have worked as a product manager at large tech companies since 2006, including Google, Pinterest, Yelp, and Facebook. My job has largely focused on algorithmic products like Google Plus Search and recommendation systems like the one that powers the Facebook newsfeed. Having worked on 4 different types of social networks, I understand how complex and nuanced these problems are. However, the choices being made inside of Facebook are disastrous for our children, for our public safety, for our privacy, and for our democracy. And that is why we must demand Facebook make changes.
So that's her basically starting off, finger in the eye on the whole thing of these guys being shut down for a few hours yesterday. I thought that was funny. But she's basically kind of given this is what I was doing, and this is my basic premise of the conversation that she's having with Congress. Let's move on to the next statement. This is somewhat of a grab bag of commentary, or just kind of important commentary that was taking place over the course of the testimony. Let's play the clip.
I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. Almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside of Facebook. The company intentionally hides vital information from the public, from the US government, and from governments around the world. The algorithms are very smart in the sense that they latch on to things that people want to continue to engage with. And unfortunately, in the case of teen girls and things like self-harm, they develop these feedback cycles where children are using Instagram as to self-soothe, but then are exposed to more and more content that makes them hate themselves. The choices being made inside of Facebook are disastrous for our children, for our public safety, for our privacy, and for our democracy. While important, these will not get to the core of the issue, which is that no one truly understands the destructive choices made by Facebook except Facebook. We can afford nothing less than full transparency. As long as Facebook is operating in the shadows, hiding its research from public scrutiny, it is unaccountable. Until the incentives change, Facebook will not change.
until the incentives change, Facebook will not change. And she's basically asking for governmental regulation on Facebook. So Ted Cruz asked the first question. He's basically bringing up this notion of the targeting towards kids and how damaging it is. And I believe it was Mike Lee that even brought this one up, where they were talking about the suicides, the body image, the anorexia, and how you can make one of a company was researching and basically made ads targeting kids for things like drug use, anorexia, and something else. And Facebook basically approved those ads and even made the point that, look, it's very possible that a human being didn't even see the ads. That they were basically trying to use AI as a way of kind of dealing with it. And AI basically only gets a small percentage of the items that are on the website, and that human eyes are basically necessary in order to deal with it. But none of that stuff is going to change because there's no incentive for it to change until Congress gets involved. This is the clip with Ted Cruz when he's bringing up censorship. Let's play the clip.
Are you concerned about political censorship at Facebook and in big tech?
I believe you cannot have a system that has as big an impact on society as Facebook does today with as little transparency as it does. I'm a strong proponent of chronological ranking or ordering by time with a little bit of spam demotion, because I think we don't want computers deciding what we focus on. We should have software that is human scaled, where humans have conversations together, not computers facilitating who we get to hear from.
So how could we get more transparency? What would produce that?
I strongly encourage the development of some kind of regulatory body that could work with academics, work with researchers, work with other government agencies to synthesize requests for data that are privacy conscious. This is an area that I'm really passionate about. And because right now, no one can force Facebook to disclose data. And Facebook has been stonewalling us, or even worse, they gave inaccurate data to researchers, as the scandal recently showed.
What data should they turn over? My time's expired. So,
for example, even data as simple as what integrity systems exist today and how well do they perform? Like, there are lots and lots of people who Facebook is conveying around the world that Facebook safety systems apply to their language, and those people aren't aware that they're using a raw, original, dangerous version of Facebook. Just basic actions like transparency would make a huge difference.
Okay, thank you.
What do you think about that? That part of the problem is transparency. I mean, I think, like we were talking about yesterday, there are a few key interlaced factors. I mean, Facebook is a company that is trying to make profit, no more, no less. And in pursuit of that, the incentives kind of go for them to kind of get engagement and keep people on the website as long as possible. Any company would do that. Twitter would do that. Any social media company has that particular incentive. Her thing is, well, look, the algorithm is the issue here. I mean, at the end of the day, if somebody put content out, it doesn't, and it was kind of this equal platform. People just put out content. Some things go big, some things go bad, but the algorithm is not necessarily feeding you things in order, to push it in a particular direction. That if you deal with the algorithm, a lot of the issues basically get resolved on some level. What do you think about her testimony? Does she still concern you as being overly focused on this notion of censorship? But she's not using the term censorship, but I think that was the way you would describe it. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But how do you take her testimony up to this point, just based on the items that was listed?
So, I liked the bit that she was saying towards the end about human scale systems and stuff, and that's super general. And like we were talking about yesterday morning, it's easy to agree over generalities until you get down to specifics and realize, wait, we mean different things by this.
Yeah.
So when she says human scale interaction, like creating a regulatory panel of academics and people who are looking into this stuff, who are regularly sort of requesting info from Facebook about how they're doing this, and Facebook should be made to comply with that. Facebook should send over transparent reviews of how their algorithms are sorting data, that kind of thing. That's one of I think the better approaches. I don't know if that's perfect or whatever, but my worry still stands, which is that people are going to use her, whether she herself has this as a motivation or whether she's just going to become a useful pawn in the argument to push for more censorship by Facebook. I'm worried about that. But a couple other things here. I want to throw in sort of a few brief curveball ideas, whatever. Yeah. One might be that Facebook, here's this very simple high-level model. We were all excited about Facebook, or at least people who were using it were excited about it because it was new, like a decade ago, 7-8 years ago. Remember Farmville? You remember these games that people were playing? And it was
Farmville,
it's not just a social network. There's like, now they have shopping. Now they have news. I remember there was this time there where Facebook was growing and they were looking to get, expand and become a much larger website and service. And now the attitude is soured. And that might be due to news coverage, might be due to the poor media coverage and the hearings and the antitrust lawsuits, everything going on in Capitol Hill. But some of that stuff might also just be due to a very high level fact, which is we've soured on Facebook. People don't like it as much anymore. This is a chicken and egg thing where people not liking it causes more scrutiny to happen. More scrutiny reveals more things for us to dislike. And we've gotten over Facebook or something. Silly model, but I'm just putting that out there. Nobody's, as far as I know, is mentioning that. And
it's on its downward slope.
It's just on its downward slope as a company, as an informational property that has to maintain its currency and its relevancy with us. It has to reassert itself to us like a brand. It has to become interesting again. And for the most part, they've been in this defensive posture where wherever you stand politically, but everybody's political these days, wherever you stand politically, there are things you don't like about what Facebook's doing. Either you're criticizing them for bullying people, for supporting bullying, and emotional abuse for teen girls who see people that they don't like, that kind of thing, or for spreading misinformation, or you're critical of Facebook for the censorship. And either way, if you have political opinions, which again, pretty much everybody does at this point, you're going to feel some way about Facebook based on the things that you already think. Right. But also, here's just briefly on the censorship thing. I don't know that I made this point clearly enough when we were talking about this yesterday. Remember when people were talking about bubbles and social media bubbles and how bubbles would keep people from having access to contrary information? Basically, you live in your bubble online.
Oh, right. You can choose the information that you want to see.
You choose information, it gets sorted and it gets filtered and you're only living in your bubble. There are better and worse ways to handle this. But in the process of bursting those bubbles, which I think I remember Facebook trying to push to do, like connecting people to have real, genuine conversations so that they don't just get stuck in those bubbles. Yeah. In the process of bursting those bubbles, people are going to get pissed at each other because we're in bubbles for reasons. We've self-selected to believe certain things. And then when we come into conflict over those beliefs in the form of debate or bullying or whatever, it can get bad. It can get, and we might just be seeing that right now. And she's talking about bullying and disinformation and a threat to our democracy. What is she talking about there? She's talking about people bickering online, being idiots to each other, and yes, admittedly spreading untrue information, that kind of thing, but that's just people doing the kinds of things they do online. Unless she is alleging a troll campaign with people with shadow, sock puppet accounts that they're in the shadows controlling.
No,
that kind of. I don't think that she's doing that. No. What she's talking about is people freely sharing information, being mean to each other online in a place where, the internet isn't usually, you don't think of it as filled with only nice people. It's filled with
love and light.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So the cancerous to democracy thing comes in. The thing is, in a weird way, it doesn't seem like her argument is basically that they are angry towards each other. It seems like those, believe it or not, it sounds like her argument is that those bubbles are somewhat reinforcing. Like, let's say a group is on Facebook, and Facebook basically feeds the person more content that they were looking at in the first place. So if a person was looking at anorexic data, well, that person feels bad about themselves, in which case they end up using Facebook more, and Facebook feeds them more information about anorexia. It's that stuff. And people can get in their own little, enclaves. I mean, even the January 6th thing.
Yes.
Or, for that matter, Rohingya or Myanmar.
Getting hit hard for that, for bullying over the Rohingya massacres.
Yeah, that type of stuff where it seems like the military was basically using Facebook as a way of either pushing down dissent or finding people who were dissenters.
Yes.
Like, I don't know. It's a complicated issue. I mean, it admittedly. And, this is not an easy thing to solve. I mean, because it really does run smack into this notion of, okay, well, yeah, but if people feel bad about themselves because they're seeing somebody else's body or somebody else's life that's phenomenal, is that really the platform's fault? And should the platform scrub out information just because you feel some kind of way about looking at somebody else's life?
Yeah.
And look, people are going to put their best foot forward regardless. That many people are going to be like, yeah, man, I was doing crack the other day, and they're going to show that on Instagram.
Well, but also here's another, if we take another step back.
Crack body.
We have our guest on the line. But okay, a lot of people apparently are on Facebook being really depressed, but they're addicted to it.
Right.
Think about all the problems in our society that we have, that a lot of people are addicted to something that makes them so depressed, and they don't have other choices that they're switching to. They don't have a community of people in person that will help to tear them away from this or reorient them, reposition them. Yeah. It's like that's the unstated obvious in the background on this issue, isn't it? That
if people had connections, real world connections, where they were part of a community, they felt valued in that community, would Facebook have as many negative consequences as it does?
Probably not at all. And of course, the whole idea there is that Facebook has intentionally and unintentionally, whatever, through some combination, come to act as a surrogate for our social lives.
Yeah.
And in the process is destroying them. And you get the self-reinforcing cycle where people reach out for sociality, like pica, when people will eat ice or whatever instead of eating food just because their brain has this weird connection. It wants to eat, but it's trying to eat something that's not actually nutritious for them. The same way they're using Facebook because they want society. They want to be in a culture. They want to have friends, but they can't find them in person. What do you say?
It's like, I want to be connected.
Yes.
But what they're connected to is basically an algorithm that is feeding them stuff.
A feeling of connection.
Yeah.
Without any of its lasting consequences, something like that. We got Mark Sloboda on the line. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we'll be speaking with Mark, international relations and security analyst, about Blinken and Lavrov's conversation, talking about returning to the JCPOA. Also, what's behind the bellicosity between Taiwan and China, and if it will lead to a war. This is a topic we were talking about a few minutes ago. We'll be back with Mark on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been having this conversation about the bellicosity between China and Taiwan ratcheting up over the past week or so. Over the weekend, China flew 77 warplanes. They call it Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, but that is, again, unilateral, and some of that stuff stretches far beyond Taiwan. But nevertheless, 77 warplanes towards the coast, or towards Taiwan. You also had the situation where the island's defense minister, Chiu Kuo-cheng, basically made the point that says China was capable of launching, well, I'll just read it. By 2025, China will bring the cost and attrition to its lowest. It has the capacity now, but it will not start a war easily, having to take many other things into consideration. Yeah, he's talking basically China can invade and take Taiwan, but they may wait for a longer period of time until they get a much stronger status just based on this notion of attrition. Joe Biden, this brings enter Joe Biden. Joe Biden had a conversation with Xi Jinping on China, and they basically seem to agree on the one China policy. This is the policy that basically accepts China as being China and Taiwan as being a member or a precinct of China. This was something that Donald Trump basically blew away. And on some level, the selling of them massive amounts of weapons undermines. Nevertheless, this is where we are. We're going to have a conversation about the geopolitics surrounding Taiwan and China and why so much, I'm going to call it hysteria, has been taking place over the last couple of weeks. Joining us is Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Well, thank you. It's always an honor and a pleasure to have you. So what should we be thinking about this? I mean, this seems to be getting that much more bellicose. I mean, there's another one. Let's see. Taiwan's Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said the territory was ready to fight, talking about Taiwan. The defense of Taiwan is in our hands. We're absolutely committed to that. He told Australia's ABC broadcaster, if China is going to launch a war against Taiwan, we will fight to the end, and that is our commitment. I'm sure that China is going to suffer. I'm sure that if China is going to launch an attack against Taiwan, I think they're going to suffer tremendously as well. I mean, what is creating all of this level of hysteria? And are you concerned at all about any kind of, let's say, military or heightening of military between these two countries, or let's say this war of words becoming somewhat kinetic?
Yes, I am absolutely worried, and I think everyone should be. To kind of understand the history, you have to remember how China, mainland China, and the Republic of China, what we call Taiwan, came about when in the 50s, when the communists won the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalists, retreated to Taiwan. And that's where they basically continued eventually, rather quickly, coming under U.S. de facto protection there. But it has been U.S. policy for decades now to recognize the one China policy. And this is kept somewhat vague intentionally. It's how they came to an agreement. But the U.S. basically recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. And that may rather confuse you, because the U.S. keeps selling large amounts of weapons to Taiwan to maintain their independence from China. And this is what you would call strategic ambiguity. This is the one China policy. That's why, we don't want to go immediately to war, so we'll agree to a vagueness and a the idea that any political reconciliation between China and Taiwan should be peaceful. All right, I think that's something both sides would actually want, but the U.S. conception of that is the Communist Party in China just goes away, and the U.S.-backed government in Taiwan suddenly controls all of Taiwan, all of mainland China, which is something that is not going to happen. I mean, let's be realistic about this. From the U.S. perspective, Taiwan deserves its independence. Right? From the Chinese perspective, the U.S. is promoting separatism of China, and they are basically turning Taiwan into a big island aircraft carrier full of military equipment to contain China. And being contained by the United States is really not something that most countries find reassuring, considering the U.S.'s history of invasions, occupations, regime changes in just the last 3 decades, never mind before that. The U.S. Navy Secretary just put out a new guideline today, a strategic guideline, and it talks about U.S. global maritime dominance and how important that is. And just briefly looking that up in the security publication online, War on the Rocks, Patrick Cronin, just a couple years ago, wrote on this subject. He's a senior director of the Asia Pacific Security Program at CNAS, the Center for New American Security, which is kind of the new bipartisan project for a new American century. And they talk about why do we need this? What is this global maritime dominance? Why should that be a priority for the U.S.? Why is that something that is so crucial to our national interest? And he said, the loss of U.S. global maritime dominance would put at risk fundamental national interests. So we need to control all the world's seas and have a much more powerful Navy than everyone else. And if we don't, it would effectively, most of what we as Americans take for granted would be put at risk. Really. It would call into question the ability of the U.S. to command offshore lines of communication. You mean tap the world's telecommunications cables? Would undermine the movement of U.S. armed forces around the world, right? Okay, so it's all about hegemony, right? We need to control the seas. China cannot be allowed to develop a powerful Navy and get out of the little box that we set for it, as acceptable, which obviously includes just off its own coast, if that, because, we need dominance. We need primacy. And China can't help but see that as a security threat.
Well, it is.
They are an import-export country, right? They depend on maritime trade. Never mind the U.S. talking about this freedom of navigation nonsense. Okay, the U.S. is the biggest threat to freedom of navigation and trade around the world. Just look at the number of Iranian oil vessels that have been seized trying to conduct trade with Venezuela or with Syria. Right? What are the legal justifications for that? U.S. sanctions. Wait a minute. Aren't those sanctions unilateral? They don't have UN backing. They're technically illegal. Yes, but that's the rule-based order, vice the actual order of international law, the UN and the UN Charter. If China sees U.S. control of its import-exports, resources going in, exports going out, of trade, which keeps China growing, keeps its domestic population happy, as something that it can't allow. And it can't allow the U.S. to keep building up Taiwan as a big, military base, essentially just off of its coast. And so we're coming into what, it's hard to see a line around this conflict when the U.S. is on the other side of the world dictating, what is and what isn't a part of China off of China's own coast. That said, the U.S. has by hook or crook, coerced a number of countries into various anti-Chinese alliances. And, when you see these explosive headlines, right, China violates Taiwan. Well, actually, the headlines usually go something like this. Chinese fighter planes fly over Taiwan, and you're like, really? And you're like, well, they didn't actually fly over it, but they violated its airspace. Really? No, well, they didn't actually violate its airspace. They violated its air defense identification zone. Well, what is an air defense identification zone? It's something that has no basis in international law. It's regulated by no international body. It's self-proclaimed. It has no real validity. It's just, hey, if you come into this area, please give us a call because we want you to. And this was something that was basically created by the U.S. and the rest of the world has slowly adopted, but it has no real backing. And Taiwan's ADIZ, actually set out by the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s, actually goes into mainland China and covers a whole province of China, many times larger than Taiwan itself is. So it's all rather ludicrous. And what China is actually doing is flying its plane well outside, off of its own coast, well outside of Taiwan's actual 12 nautical miles, if you would consider that they actually deserve that. Again, they're not recognized as a state. So the U.S. calls this provocative military coercion. They say it is destabilizing to the region and that it could cause, a military miscommunication leading to an unintentional military confrontation. However, the U.S. and its allies are just patrolling the areas off of China with 3 aircraft carriers and a 16-ship fleet. That, however, is good freedom of navigation exercise, right? It's completely different. We're on the other side of the world and we're off China's coast, but that's the good stuff. When China flies planes just off its own coast, that's provocative coercion. When the U.S. flies its naval ships up and down off the Chinese coast on the other side of the world, good freedom of navigation. And you got that distinction, right? It's perfectly clear to everyone.
Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, doesn't it? I mean, okay, so you understand that this is all about propaganda, right? This is about hegemony. This is about primacy. And China's not allowed out of this little box that we set for it. And if they try to get out of that little box, it means war. And that's what U.S. geopoliticians, strategic thinkers, military brass refer to the Thucydides trap, the ancient Greek political philosopher that says if you have a failing hegemon and a rising hegemon, conflict is inevitable. And that's the way they look at it. And that's what they're preparing for. And they are putting, short intermediate range ballistic missiles. That's why they pulled out of the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty. It had nothing to do with alleged Russian violations. They perceive a missile gap in a coming naval war with China off the coast of China, and they think they want more land-based missiles to add to the already sea and air-based missiles to fight that war. And I hate to tell you, with China's growing economy, they are going to have, in just a few years, a capability to deter the United States, at least off their own coast there. And soon they'll have a true, blue water navy, a deep navy.
Okay, so take you at your word. Say that is the truth then, and the United States sees that. Does that mean that this is the window of opportunity, and that's why things are heating up right now, Mark?
Yeah, that is everyone realizes that this is a very tense moment. And it's made more tense politically because the U.S. has basically been putting out signals that it intends to either abrogate the one China policy, which it has had for decades, or to recognize Taiwan in some way. U.S. ally NATO member Lithuania, tiny little country in Eastern Europe, has stepped into this as kind of the staking horse, if you will, and has opened a representative office for Taiwan in Lithuania. Well, China is furious about this because they rightly recognize that this is just one little step towards recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. And, that will mean more.
So that basically that's a red line.
That is the red line. That's a red line, absolutely, for China. And it has to be said that China looks at this continual U.S. selling of advanced arms to Taiwan, and they're starting, to say, well, you give them this and this and this, and that is becoming a red line for us as well.
I don't mean to be denigratory towards Lithuania, as I think, in fact, our engineer, Andre, I believe, is Lithuanian. But it's a small country. You're not talking about France.
No, it's very tiny.
That's a small country. What do you think that's overblown, or do you think that is the red line? Any country, any move, anything pushing
any
over
country, any country. Of course, it's a Western country, and they're leading the top of the anti-China, anti-Russia rhetoric. That's the way they're billing themselves. They just built a big, nice condition military base there that they want the U.S. to come and occupy in Lithuania.
Very weird.
Because they want more U.S. troops in Lithuania. Kind of like the Fort Trump idea in Poland.
Yeah.
Well, this is, the same idea in Lithuania. And this is one of the ways they are basically trying to kiss U.S. government butt in order to get the U.S. to send troops to their own country, is by taking the lead on this on China and proving what a good democracy versus autocracy ally they are.
Basically a good vassal state. This is extreme. I mean, is Daniel Ellsberg made the point, I think this was maybe several months, maybe even a year ago, that back during the U.S. was willing to basically use nuclear weapons potentially in order to defend Taiwan. And Ellsberg was raising this kind of balloon of saying, hey, this is problematic. This needs to be addressed and this needs to be dealt with. How far do you think the United States would go in defense of Taiwan? I mean, certainly it realizes it can't win a war on its coast, on the Chinese coast. Not just that this would most likely lead to some level of a nuclear exchange between the two countries. I mean, this seems to be provocative in somewhat of an insane way. How far would the U.S. go with this?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, especially after the Afghanistan withdrawal. But recent polls in the U.S. show that just over half of Americans believe that the U.S. should go to war to defend Taiwan, presumably as an independent country, which is kind of scary. And you have to wonder why Americans are willing to send their sons and daughters to die for a Taiwan separated from China. And from the Chinese perspective, this is all about their own national security, their security from a U.S. building a military redoubt right off their coast. So this all gets very serious. And this is, again, we're entering this time window. Right now, China has some 200 to 300 nuclear weapons, and relatively few of those can be launched quickly and are on ICBMs capable of hitting the United States. Meanwhile, of course, the U.S. has some 1,600 nuclear weapons ready to be launched at a moment, and they can deliver them by bombers, by submarines, by intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they have substantial missile defense set up.
Yeah, but the problem
is we have this window. If there was a conventional fight that breaks out between the U.S. and China, and it went nuclear, the U.S. could probably count on taking out most of China's, quote, strategic deterrent before it was capable of hitting the United States. So if they go to war now, rather than when China builds up a more substantial nuclear arsenal in 10 or 20 years down the road, then it's less of a nuclear threat to the United States.
No, but
and that's why that time window is so scary.
But there's been conversations between China and Russia in this kind of joint military capacity. And tell me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Any war with China is basically a war with Russia also. They have military alliances. Or is that true? I mean, I've seen commentary by these guys. I mean, were they just being provocative?
Formal alliance. Yeah, they don't have a formal alliance, right? They have a strategic partnership. And they're growing interoperability and all these things. But if there was a war with the U.S. and China off the Chinese coast, would Russia become involved? At what point would they become involved? No one knows the answer to that question. No one knows. A lot of people suspect, that they wouldn't. Would Russia enter a nuclear exchange? Well, at some point, they might figure, well, if they finish with China, they'll come for us next. But, they could be counting on each side doing significant damage to each other. So without absence of a formal military alliance, like, say, NATO, no one knows for sure at the moment.
Mark, I want to step back from the brink for just a second. I want to talk about this window of opportunity a little bit more. The U.S. will be trying to extend that window of opportunity and just do anything it can to delay China's rise. What types of actions, just for our audience in terms of making sense of major moves here? I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty obvious, but what kinds of things would the U.S. be doing to try to delay that? How would China push back? I'm just curious what you see coming in terms of, okay, these are predictable actions by these actors. Mark? Sure.
Well, first of all, the buildup of the U.S. military in the Pacific has been ongoing, right? Pivot, they call it the Asian pivot, moving military forces around the world and slowly concentrating them in, the Asia Pacific, what they now call the Indo-Pacific, to try to draw India into the whole thing. They are, going to be building more naval ships and trying to get more of them, operating as closely as possible off the Chinese coast. They're going to be putting land-based short intermediate range missiles in Guam. They would like to put them in Japan and a couple of other spots out there in the islands. They're trying to get all of their allies and every country in the world they can to decouple economically from China. So that is part of an economic war. They would like to stir political unrest in China, like they were involved with in Hong Kong in the last few years. You can see that all of these steps are things that they are doing. They are building overlapping anti-Chinese militarist alliances. We have the Quad, which tries to bring India into this thing. The U.S. would be glad to fight China to the last bit of Indian cannon fodder there. Now you have this new AUKUS deal, Australia, the UK, and the US, that includes a lot of military and intelligence sharing, but also will give Australia nuclear submarines so that its nuclear submarines can sit operationally in the South China Sea for 7 times longer. This is all steps they are taking, and it all leads to military confrontation with China. While they're saying we don't want military confrontation with China, they are doing everything that China will see as a military threat and respond with a like buildup on the other side.
We've got to close it. We've got to close it here, but I see it too, Mark. We've been talking about this. We'll keep it going. Thank you, Mark Sloboda, one of our best guests. He's an international relations and security analyst. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A great, disturbing conversation with Mark, because you can kind of see it, right? I mean, like the provocations that take place where it's this level of brinksmanship of, and by the way, the United States was willing to go to nuclear war over Cuba. Similar situation, military armaments at the coast or on the coast of the country. The U.S. is like, whoa, that's a red line. We're not going to allow that, even to the point of nuclear war. And here we have basically the U.S. doing the same thing to Taiwan or doing the same thing to China, using Taiwan as this kind of militaristic, bulwark against China and bolstering alliances with, let's say, Australia, Japan, et cetera, in order to create this war zone or this kill box. I mean, it's astonishing stuff. Simultaneously saying, we don't want a war here. We're just trying to, freedom of navigation. It's like, it's nonsense. They're sleepwalking into a war and basically using propaganda to absolve itself of blame in going into it.
Well, I mean, kind of, but the other thing here, of course, is we build up more weapons. It's like, in our eyes, the more weapons we have, theoretically, the less of an incentive they're going to have to try to take over Taiwan. And so we can just delay this. We can keep that window open longer by spending more on arms, equipping more of our allies in the region with more arms, that kind of thing, and just push it. The problem with that, of course, in my view, is all the potential energy. You've got kinetic energy in a system, you've got the motion of the particles, you also have potential energy like tensions, things that build up that could be unleashed, chemical reactions that could suddenly come into play.
You only need one match.
You only need a catalyst.
Yeah.
Somewhat reference to our headline on Nobel Prize for Chemistry being awarded to organocatalysts. But anyway.
And by the way, that is what happened in the First World War. I mean, all of these guys were having these military buildups. You had Germany going against the UK for Navy supremacy and all this other stuff.
And Taiwan, the fate of Taiwan was a direct outcome of World War II. It was within just a couple of months of the closing of aggressions, the General Order Number 1, basically ordering Japanese surrender. You had Taiwan as this sort of standout island nation that Chiang Kai-shek, like he was saying, led to. This was within just a couple of months of the closing of World War II. So all of this debate between mainland China and, the Republic of China, that's
came out of that war.
That's in this period. That's in this era. These are problems of this era.
Wild stuff. Terrifying stuff. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 98,506 new COVID cases. Oh, it dropped. Reported, along with 1,808 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 101,668 cases per day, a decrease of 24% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 65% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,925,355 people across the United States and has needlessly killed, an unfortunate 705,394 men, women, and children in this country. In national news, Joe Biden has stated that Democrats could change the filibuster rules in order to raise the debt ceiling. To this, Joe Manchin basically says, no. So once again, we have this political back and forth where Joe Manchin, for whatever reason, not being elected president, is basically have a veto on the president's agenda. Very interesting stuff. Former White House Chief of Staff under Trump, Mark Meadows, and other top aides have been subpoenaed by the House committee looking into the January 6th riot. An inside source says that these people are planning to defy the order and refuse to surrender over documents and other files to the committee. Interesting. President Biden told reporters yesterday that he has discussed Taiwan in his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping last month. He stated that the two came to terms and, quote, will abide by the Taiwan agreement, unquote. This was referring to the long-standing diplomatic understanding that the United States recognizes Beijing as the sole legal government of China, without clarifying that the United States' position on Taiwan's sovereignty. It's not splendid ambiguity. It's something else. What was the strategic ambiguity is what it's called, I suppose. For some reason, I kept wanting to say splendid ambiguity. I think that's something else. That's a British thing. Yesterday, some 1,400 employees went on strike at Kellogg's cereal plant all over the United States. Union president accused the cereal company of, quote, demanding workers give up health care and retirement benefits and holiday and vacation pay, unquote. Kellogg's spokesperson, Chris Bonner, said the company offers benefits and compensation among the best in the industry. Well, that doesn't necessarily deny what the person said above. The Biden administration is moving to relax the rules for student loan forgiveness program. The program would erase all remaining debt as long as the student or teacher makes 10 years of payments consistently. Previously, 90% of applicants have been rejected for this program. According to the administration, more than 550,000 borrowers will move closer to forgiveness. In international news, natural gas has risen nearly 400% since the beginning of the year all over Europe. British wholesale gas has seen a 23% increase at the pump. In tech news, a group of 20 Blue Origin employees got together and penned an essay listing numerous safety and other concerns with the company. Overall, the company, quote, values the optics of Jeff Bezos over safety of its rockets, unquote. The employees recounted how they were getting pressure to go faster rather than smarter every step of the way. Many could not even watch the launch in July because the speed at which the program was run meant the possibilities of many things going wrong. In conclusion, the employees believe it is only a matter of time before the rockets explode, and they would not set foot on one. Wow.
Damning.
That is
damning for Blue Origin.
Yeah.
Blue Origin's undergoing. Yeah.
That is brutal.
Yeah, Elon Musk is in the win on this one, for sure.
Yeah. Right. Jeff Bezos. I mean, it puts you in the mind of, we'll come back to it, of the Boeing 747. And basically that, the finances and the economics of it took priority over the engineering of it. These kind of cross incentives, even though both of them are necessary. In Earth and Science news, Nobel Prize in Chemistry given to Benjamin Liss and David McMillan for their simultaneous development of a model of organocatalysts back in 2000. Organocatalysts. And you're making the point this is a third series of catalysts or something to that effect?
Organocatalysis. So basically, you'd have two classes of catalysts. You'd have enzymes and metals. Enzymes being biological, metals clearly not biological. And it's based on enzymes, but they sort of developed, I don't know specifics. I'm giving
basically a third layer.
A third type of catalyst.
Yeah.
They created this. It's interesting how this stuff works. They had independently converged on the idea without working with each other back in the year 2000.
Yeah.
So people were saying, I don't know why this stuff wasn't discovered earlier, but there's this idea of independent convergence where scientists or even in the arts, people will come onto the same theme at the same time without any explicable
association with one another. Yeah.
Reason for why that happened.
Yeah, that's happened a lot actually over the history of time. I can't think of the things, but I remember reading about this in a while ago. But yeah, it's a very weird phenomena. It's like somebody is in two separate parts of the world hit upon the exact same idea.
Classically, Leibniz and Newton independently invented calculus at about the same time, doing using different notations, but and then they hit it. They hit it, and there was this debate over who actually invented it, but they did it in different ways. Anyway,
very cool. In the wake of California oil spill last weekend, California lawmakers are pushing to ban all offshore oil drilling. The spill dumped around 126,000 gallons of crude oil into the ocean. I remember reading something on this where they thought it might have been an anchor that, I guess, disturbed or hit one of these pipelines or something to that effect, but there needs to be more information on what caused it. In business news, Saudi Aramco hit $2 trillion valuation, puts Aramco just behind Microsoft and Apple as the world's most valuable companies. And in holiday news or holidays, National Walk and Bike to School Day, World Cerebral Palsy Day, National Noodle Day, and of course, earlier, there was the National Give Your Daughter or Mama Give Daughter Money Day. I have no idea how that one started. Next week is apparently Give Your Son Money Day, but that's where we are. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
How about Give Your Parents Money Day?
Or that day. I mean,
there is Mother's Day, there is Father's Day.
Very true. And if I'm not mistaken, I thought there was Kids Day or something to that effect also.
We like our holidays here in the States. Austin said this after that Blue Origin essay was published. Remember the people who are criticizing, working inside Blue Origin, criticizing the safety of the rocket. After that Blue Origin essay was published, this is Austin. star William Shatner agreed to go up into space with Blue Origin on their next flight. That was only a couple of days after this letter had been published.
Oh,
hopefully,
William Shatner, don't go, dog. Don't go, bro.
Fingers, keep him in your thoughts and
don't
prayers.
go, bro. That would be the greatest loss to humanity if Captain Kirk takes an L on a starship, an old starship.
If you're being real with me, if between William Shatner and what's the other dude's name? The other main captain, Next Generation captain. Picard, the guy who plays him.
Yeah.
Between them, which would you rather lose, Jamarl?
I don't want to lose either one of them.
Picard
Both of them are phenomenal. So if you're asking me which actor is better or which series is better,
actor.
I got to be honest. Jean-Luc Picard, what is his name? I can't think of his name. It'll come to me in a moment. He is a better actor, clearly.
Patrick Stewart, right?
Patrick Stewart is a better actor. He's like a British trained stage actor, and he is phenomenal at what he does. And even I would make a case that Next Generation, the episodes were somewhat better, even though I have this sweet spot for Captain Kirk in the original Enterprise. Love the original Enterprise. But there's something about Next Generation that was far more profound in the concepts, the ideas that they would hit upon.
So William Shatner. You would rather kill William Shatner?
No, I can't say that. I can't say that.
If it's
like a trolley problem.
Exactly, that sort of situation. I don't know, man. William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, they did the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins. You ever hear that? One of the great sci-fi fantasy crossovers.
No,
The song, I'm not going to try to sing it.
Did they?
It's been a long time since I've heard it, and I'd embarrass myself. And people aren't choosing to listen to this radio show to hear me singing the Ballad of Bilbo Baggins, but still, no, they did that together. And I don't know if I could lose William Shatner, the guy who decided to do that.
Their relationship.
The Camp King.
I would say that the relationship between Kirk and Spock, it has to be one of the best relationships in all of sci-fi. I mean, it's just phenomenal that the way that these two got together. And I mean, like in one of the episodes where, one of the movies, the Khan one, where, and I'm talking about the original movie, not the remake of it, where Spock basically gives his life in order to save the ship. And Kirk is like just pained over this. Like he's just, it's like he breaks down, the captain of the ship, as Spock basically dies in front of everybody. I mean, the movie theater, all of these people are basically in tears over, Spock dying in this particular way. And he's putting his hand up and he's like, "You've always been my friend." And he's like, "Oh my God, Spock." It's like he killed off Spock.
I think I've seen
and then they flipped it in the new one where Kirk is the one that basically took the L and Spock basically goes bananas and, goes and go to Khan. No, man, the relationship for those things were phenomenal. I mean, even if I'm not mistaken, Black Hole, the first kiss between interracial kiss between a white man and a black woman, all of those things were taking place on Star Trek. It has a storied history, to put it mildly.
It does for sure.
The Blue Origin thing is a big deal, though. That is a massive, massive big deal. So if NASA is building a rocket ship and they're going through creating something for space, they don't have an incentive for this kind of economic expansion stuff. I mean, whatever technology that NASA makes or creates in order to do whatever they're going to do will get pushed out to companies and everything else, makes things smaller, faster, better, etc. But they don't have this ingrained incentive of, okay, we need to maximize our profit. Well, Blue Origin does. And yet you still have to attend to the engineering associated with whatever they're doing. And so you get this kind of weird thing of where Bezos like, faster, faster, faster.
Yeah,
and it's like, dude, we have to deal with the engineering realities of the stuff.
Safe, especially
it has to be safe.
If you're trying to use it for space tourism, I don't think that a lot of millionaires are going to want to risk their life. I mean, I guess some people for sure would. Some people are daredevils, just at any wealth.
But I don't necessarily think they want to, take their lives in their own hands because this guy was speeding the process along.
I don't know, man. You see those people autoerotic asphyxiation. These people take the lives. Some of these people are crazy, Jamarl. They kill themselves that way, and I don't. No, I'm just throwing that in there. But
let them get their, jellies off.
Exactly. There's this other NASA story that I wanted to bring up actually briefly. Where I think we're going to add this into the next batch of headlines. They're going to be launching, the movie Armageddon.
Yes.
Where
I saw that.
Astronauts land on an asteroid because it was going to hit Earth, and they detonated something on the asteroid to make its course change.
Well, they were trying to do the course change for this particular asteroid, but they're using. So that was one heroic way of doing it, right? Where it's like, okay, we're going to blow this asteroid up, and Bruce Willis saves the day. The other way is having a bit of mass or satellite basically fly around it, basically using gravity to change the coordinates just by a few degrees, and depending upon how far away it is, it can take it in a different direction.
So this one, NASA is doing this launch. It's not even gonna do the ballet-like orbiting thing you were talking about. That's too graceful. This is gonna shoot like a bullet, going faster than the speed of a bullet. It is going to shoot. They say it's basically going to be launched on a which one of these? It's one of the Elon Musk rockets, one of the Falcons. I think Falcon 9. Yes, SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket going to be launched on that. the DART spacecraft. So again, it's an attachment that they're going to be launching. They're not throwing a Falcon 9 rocket into this asteroid. And technically, it's actually the moon of an asteroid, which I didn't even know existed.
The moon of an asteroid?
They call it a moonlet, but they're also referring to it as a moon simply. Basically, some asteroids, if they're large enough, will have other smaller rotating bodies around them.
Oh, wait.
Little tiny mini
is this
moons.
the thing that they were talking about that it was calling a planetoid once before, and then they realized it was a comet?
Are you talking about Pluto?
No. It was there was this thing that they thought was a planetoid. They thought it was like this kind of planet because of the size, and they realized, whoa, that thing is moving, and that thing is headed towards a solar system.
Yeah, I remember that. No, I don't know.
This is different.
This is This is a much. Think of like 500 feet diameter, pretty darn small, really truly small. But I believe. So to correct, they're not going to be shooting it into the asteroid. They're going to be shooting it into the asteroid's moonlet.
Okay.
And apparently it's going to be at a close enough point in its orbital trajectory around Earth that you can actually, people with telescopes can actually see the crash.
Yeah.
Which is just interesting to think about. So, I don't know how accessible it would be to amateur telescopes, but if people are interested in watching this thing, apparently they can. And should be interesting.
Now, why are they doing this? Is it just to test capabilities of trying to deter items that may hit the country, hit the world, or is it because it is in a path of hitting the world and they're trying to...
Oh, it is definitely not, because unless this is some super secret, if it's in the path of hitting the world and they're about...
Because it was like, are we going to get beamed by asteroids? You guys are just kind of
being told about that.
Right.
You should have given us way more of a heads up on this one. No, that's not what's going on.
Well, should we be told about it? Is that something that you keep to yourself until you fail at being able to deter it? Or is this something you tell the public immediately and have the public freak out?
This is the interesting thing. We're over time, and I don't want to hold our guest too long. But I read an interesting essay about panics recently, and how panics, and it was specifically written post-COVID and the declaration of the pandemic. It was written maybe a month and a half ago, something like that, pretty recently. So they were looking at COVID and how public officials were responding. But it was it was like a scholarly analysis of the literature on panics from a sort of public policy preparedness standpoint of like, okay, how do we, at what point should we tell the public what thing? Should we lie to them because we're afraid they're going to panic? And what it found was that in the vast majority of cases, quote unquote panic actually looks like people coming together and helping each other in what they perceive as a time of crisis, whether it's like bombings during World War II, even in a lot of instances of plague, where you would actually want people to get further away, natural disaster, cases like this where you might think, oh, people are going to freak out, they're going to start rioting and looting and stuff. Turns out, they actually come together and band together in a way. So my take is you tell them about it.
Yeah.
In the vast majority of cases. But regardless, we're going into our break. When we come back, we'll be speaking with David Marples, university professor at the University of Alberta, talking about the Pandora Papers, this new tranche of files released on the tax havens and exploits, tax-saving exploits, often illegal, of politicians, celebrities, the rich, the world around. We'll be talking about this in Ukraine specifically with President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is being highlighted as a culprit in this practice, in this new release, these Pandora Papers. Anyway, we'll be back with David Marples on the other side of this break, talking about Ukraine, Zelensky, tax saving, tax laundering, that kind of thing. On the other side of this break, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So a massive trove of private financial records were shared with the Washington Post. In this case, I believe it was 11.9 million to be exact. And this was basically billions or trillions of dollars that were hidden offshore. And the world leaders, the ultra-rich, basically having the largest stake in this. You have revelations include more than $100 million spent by King Abdullah II of Jordan on luxury homes in Malibu, California, and other locations, millions of dollars in property, cash secretly owned by the leaders of Czech Republic, Kenya, Ecuador, and other countries. Waterfront house in Monaco, acquired by a Russian woman who gained considerable wealth after she reportedly had a child with Putin. Basically, the world leaders around the world, including Ukrainian President Zelensky, who won on a corruption campaign, is looking mighty corrupt in this moment. To have a conversation, we're joined with Dr. David Marples. He's the Distinguished University Professor in the Department of History and Classics, University of Alberta. He is the Director of Stasuski Program for the Study Contemporary Ukraine, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and President, North American Association of Belarusian Studies. Professor, or Dr. Marples, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So the Pandora Papers, in the context of the Panama Papers, and there was one other P-name papers, basically trillions of dollars of wealth that are kept offshore. And that could be in the United States. I mean, from South Dakota, Alaska, despite the United States protestations, to Switzerland and some of the other countries or smaller countries that do stuff like this. Or we can talk about these other tax havens. But basically, we're talking about trillions of dollars that are basically kept from the various countries, either kept in trust or kept in tax havens, in this kind of financial limbo that allows the ultra-rich to avoid paying their fair share to their societies. How does the Pandora Papers fit in with the other, let's say, large leaks and large releases that we've come accustomed to over the course of the last several years?
Well, it fits right in there. It's simply the latest installment, I would say, but it's bigger. It seems to be bigger, and it seems to have affected more people, and it seems to be harder for people to avoid being publicized. As we can see, you've already described many world leaders that are caught up in this web, including Vladimir Putin, including former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and including, surprisingly for me, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who prior to this came out as a fairly squeaky clean figure, and in fact someone who came to power to combat corruption. So it's a supreme irony, if you like, that one of the people who came to combat corruption, in fact is doing so right now in Ukraine, is caught up in this web too. So I think it's an unusual thing, and I think it's unexpected. I don't think it was expected to come out when it did.
Well, from your take on it, what's Zelensky's influence here? Because you make the point of, he comes in on an anti-corruption campaign, and he's looking pretty bad in these documents. What are the documents implying, or at the very least showing, or what image of Zelensky are the documentation of the Pandora Papers showing?
Well, they're showing that his company, that is the company of his former comedy show called Kvartal 95, took ownership of a number of offshore companies, specifically, I think, in the British Virgin Islands, Belize, and Cyprus. And Cyprus is well known as a haven for that part of the world. So it was set up around 2012, and the TV stations they were making content for were owned by a noted oligarch, an infamous oligarch in Ukraine called Ihor Kolomoisky, former governor of what was then called Dnipropetrovsk province, now called Dnipro. And he has been suspected of multi-billion-dollar fraud through a bank that he owned called Privat Bank. I mean, that case has been going on for some time now. And part of the network were a man called Serhiy Shafir, who is currently the chief aide of Zelensky, and Ivan Bakanov, who is the head of Ukraine's security service today. They're all part of this same network. And they use these companies, for one thing, to buy expensive properties in central London. I mean, these things worth in a couple of $1 million, maybe a couple of £1 million, I should be more exact, each. When the election took place in 2019, Zelensky transferred his shares. I think he just simply handed them over to Shafir. But he made an arrangement that his family would continue to receive funds after he became president. And reportedly, his wife today continues to receive dividends from these same companies. So even today, she's getting benefits from being in this sort of scheme. And these companies, allegedly, according to the advisors of Zelensky, were set up to protect him from the aggressive actions of the president at that time, a man called Viktor Yanukovych, notoriously corrupt, who fled the country in 2014 after a mass uprising known as the Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity. So this is why I think it is so shocking to many people in Ukraine. Zelensky won the election in Ukraine 2 years ago by a massive margin. He got 73% in the second round against the then current president Poroshenko, whose name came up in a previous revelation about offshore companies. So, the man he replaced also was involved in similar schemes. And today, Poroshenko's faction in parliament is, of course, bloated, almost like we told you so. He's not clean either. And they are among those most prominent, I think, in comments about Zelensky's corruption now in Ukraine. So it's a complete reversal of what the situation seemed to be 2 years ago.
Well, and again, underscoring the irony here, and thank you for joining us, by the way, great to speak with you. Zelensky came to power on a mandate to sweep out corruption. And he was a genuinely sort of exciting, interesting, populist, but not in an extreme way. He had this TV show. He was an interesting candidate and an interesting president since then. Although, of course, mired Ukraine has all sorts of internal political divides, factionalism, and it seems like he's been drawn by these into many different corners, like a bed of Procrustes. He can't get that much done. But with this specifically, if he's coming to the fore, campaigning against corruption, and then he does this. Now, you mentioned Petro Poroshenko, the previous presidents of Ukraine, the Panama Papers, actually. So there are 3 sets of papers that have been released by the ICIJ, part of this project. You have the Panama Papers, and the Paradise Papers, and most recently, of course, the Pandora Papers, all P alliterative there. Petro Poroshenko had been targeted. I remember back in mid-2016, I started to see these articles coming out when I was doing this research because I was looking into Ukraine and Russiagate. There were connections there. I was trying to figure out. Anyway, the Panama Papers had actually targeted Poroshenko. He was one of the people. His administration had, been brought to the light what they'd been doing back in mid-2016, basically similarly laundering money in Cyprus, in the British Virgin Islands, also in the Netherlands. How significant, looking back at the allegations back then, there are millions of euros. I think 4 million euros, nearly 4 million was moved out of Ukraine, from what I'm seeing here, under Poroshenko. How bad does Zelensky look in terms of the amount of money being used here and how shady it seems?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's very difficult right now to find an exact figure that would compare with that of Poroshenko. I think the difference, though, is that Poroshenko was known as an oligarch before he became the president of Ukraine. And in 2014, when he ran for election after the mass uprising, he sort of told his electorate that he would give up his companies. He would give up his Russian company, for example, the chocolate company that he owns in Ukraine and other different countries down Europe, have branches of it. He didn't, but that was the promise when he became president in 2014, whereas Zelensky, right now it seems to be a somewhat smaller scale than Poroshenko, but nevertheless very significant. He came to power as a complete outsider. Absolutely no one had heard of Zelensky in Ukrainian politics prior to 2019, or maybe to late 2018 when it seemed that he might run. He was a comedian. He was a comedian in a program that highlighted corruption in Ukraine. He was portrayed as a history professor, I don't think he was even a professor. He was a school teacher who dismissed corruption and made a big speech about getting rid of the corrupt officials. And 3 years or something afterwards, he ran for election on the same program. His political party, Servant of the People, is exactly the same name that was used in the TV program. So you couldn't find a kind of cleaner outsider. And I think this is why the electorate voted for Zelensky, that he was someone you couldn't possibly accuse of being corrupt, because nearly all the previous presidents had problems of that scale, not necessarily corrupt with offshore companies, but people who've been compromised in some way. Leonid Kuchma was sort of suspected of murdering a journalist who gave him a lot of trouble. Viktor Yushchenko came through the banking system, then spent most of his time outside the country. And then this notorious Yanukovych presidency, where he lived in this palatial mansion just outside Kiev. He had a whole zoo in there. And this thing was something like 20,000 square feet. He had servants there. Ridiculous wealth. And then finally, to get rid of him, and Poroshenko claims to give up all his property and things, and then doesn't.
It doesn't. And then Zelensky comes in. You have oligarch after oligarch after oligarch after oligarch, and then you have a guy who comes in saying he's going to sweep up the corruption. And guess what? He employs the tactics of the oligarchs.
Well, and also the fact that he's been tied to Kolomoisky. You know, this was always the suspicion about Zelensky, that he was still in Kolomoisky's pocket. Once he got elected, Kolomoisky, who had been forced to live abroad, came back to Ukraine, got very much involved in politics again, and he's still in Ukraine. He's not officially part of the team, but he's in the background. And now it raises the question, has he been sort of holding the key to power all this time? Has he been directing things in Ukraine behind the scenes? And that, I think, will come up now. Zelensky's popularity, by the way, in the most recent poll I saw, was 45%, and it's gone up from about 23% in recent months. He was by far the most popular politician still in Ukraine. Poroshenko was second. He's somewhere around 18, 17%. So this is going to change the political spectrum, I think, in Ukraine. Although at the moment, there's no way to have an early election or even change the makeup of parliament, which is still a slight majority servant of the people, although that party is badly split as well.
You know, of all of the countries that are listed in the Panama Papers, apparently Ukraine has the highest number of politicians that are included. And one of the most interesting aspects of this has to do with people who are around Zelensky, basically his inner circle. And there's this question on whether or not some of these guys are basically being his wallet. Zelensky apparently transferred certain, I guess, resources over to some of the people that were near him. One gentleman named Shifir, I may be mangling that name, but basically top assistant to Zelensky. Does the wallet thing hold true? That basically some of the people that are around him, Zelensky can transfer certain wealth over to the various other members, so he himself is not necessarily holding the bag for it, and yet he still has access to it. And also, what effect is this going to have politically? I mean, if he came in on anti-corruption and the people basically backed him for anti-corruption, this basically allows an end by his political opponents to take a chunk out of his hide, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Shafir is his current chief aide. And something like 10 days ago, I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but there was an attempt to assassinate him in the center of Kiev. Gunfire was fired on his car, it hit his driver, and he narrowly escaped being assassinated, which many journalists suggested that the attempt was possibly made by oligarchs who were concerned about Zelensky's campaign to expose oligarchs in Ukraine, identify them, and define them. You know, what constitutes an oligarch? How much money do you need to be called an oligarch? And so this gives an idea of how far the campaign was going, but also how much opposition there is in Ukraine to a campaign to undermine the oligarchs and remove them from the power structure, which has been the problem in Ukraine for years. I mean, that's its biggest problem. And as you mentioned, in Parliament, until recently at least, 1 in 4 deputies, MPs, was a millionaire. And that was the case under Poroshenko, for example, and it was the case under the previous president, Yanukovych, when most of them became installed. And so I think today the difficulty is going to be retaining this popularity, as you mentioned. But on the other hand, if you look at the opposition to Ukraine, who could you say is completely clean? And my feeling is that it will benefit most the pro-Russian opposition bloc. The pro-Russian opposition bloc is sitting fourth right now in terms of popularity of parties in the parliament. Its leader, Yuri Boyko, a well-known politician, but no one's ever accused him of corruption. He is another one who's he's pro-Russian, but he's not involved in these types of circles. So it may be that that group can benefit the most as being completely opposed to the government, because all the governments in power, with the exception of Yanukovych, since 2004, have been pro-Europe, pro-Western, and largely pro-NATO as well. And this applies also to Zelensky, who came to power, but more or less continued the policies that Poroshenko had advocated, that is, moving closer to the European Union, moving closer to the United States, and appealing to the United States to help in this prolonged war with Russia, which has sort of grabbed Ukrainian territories and hung on to them, like Crimea and parts of the eastern Donbass, which have also affected the Ukrainian economy. And one final point that I wanted to make on this same note is that, Ukraine is the second poorest country in Europe. The monthly salary, an average, is about $800 a month, something like that. So it's low, and it compares badly with the countries around it. In terms of GDP, I mean, Belarus, just to the north, we think of Belarus as a poor country. But in terms of GDP, it's doing better than Ukraine. And so these are the types of comparisons I think you need when people are making a lot of money at the top level, whereas the mass of population is struggling to survive.
That sounds like the recent history of Ukraine, and I'm sad to say that, again, Zelensky, trying to put him in context here for a Western audience that might not be as familiar with him, was kind of majorly exciting for this country that there's only so much that any person can do. And the problems that the Euromaidan brought to the fore, and I would argue exacerbated, hadn't gone away, still haven't gone away. Zelensky came in trying to bring the nation together, it seems, from the outside. Whoever comes out in power, from this, whoever benefits from this ultimately, what you said there made sense. That's sort of its own thing. But another side of this, who's actually going to decide to investigate this and prosecute this? What do you think legally, criminally is going to happen as a result of this? Because, hey, if Zelensky's doing it, if people close to Zelensky are doing it, well, they're part of the government. And I'm guessing that scrutiny, if it were applied to them, would start to extend pretty quickly through a lot of other people in government in Ukraine, whether it's the other oligarchs in the country who might not be partaking in direct factional battles and the politics going on right now, but would still be part of the network. There are a lot of people who, if you started to shine a light on, around, I'm sure you'd start to find a lot more worth investigating. So because of that, I doubt anybody's going to want to pursue this too seriously. What do you think is actually practically going to happen? Do you think Zelensky's going to fall? Do you think the people close to him are going to fall? Or is it just going to fall to election time and him not doing so well on the next election? What do you think is going to happen here?
I don't think it will have any immediate impact on the political scene in Ukraine, other than to push Zelensky in the same direction as his predecessors and become more defensive, reluctant to carry on this campaign, anti-corruption campaign that is probably making more progress recently, I would say, than at any time previously. But it's not traditionally been very successful because, as you say, there are a number of people who don't want to be investigated. Some of them are in the sort of high positions carrying out this campaign. I mean, you've got the corrupt investigating the corrupt. And that can only lead to further political inertia, I think, that there's no real party right now that can come forward and say, well, look, we're clean, look at us, that has any popular standing currently in Ukraine. I mean, there may be one in the future, and it's possible that you could get some politician come forward in the same sort of manner. But whoever comes forward has got to deal with the already existing entrenched oligarchs. And the question then is how to get rid of them. I mean, if you look at Russia, which is where the problem is even worse, Putin came to the fore in 2000 and said, well, look, to the oligarchs, you either stand with me or you get out of the way. You get out of the country or I'm going to imprison you. And so the oligarchs around Putin are directly supporting the presidency. They're very loyal to Putin. The richest oligarchs are the most loyal. And this same kind of system could prevail in Ukraine, where you keep the same system, but you keep the people loyal to you. And that would lead to enhanced power at the top, the president being very powerful. And to its credit, Ukraine has had a fairly democratic political system in terms of electoral changes. Ukraine has had, I forget how many presidents now, I think this is the 6th president of Ukraine. Kravchuk, Kuchma, Yushchenko, Yanukovych, Poroshenko, and now Zelensky. And you compare that with, say, Russia or Belarus. Belarus has only had one president to date. Russia's had two. If you discount the years when Putin was prime minister, effectively two. So Ukraine's looked good from this perspective, and it's looked good to its European partners.
Right, kind of, but it's also split leadership. And I'm sorry for cutting in. This is where, we will start to probably rub up into some of our differences. But the Euromaidan, for instance, that wasn't a democratic election. That was an uprising that sometimes got violent. And, I was having a conversation actually with somebody at the station just the other day. We were talking about Ukraine, and we're getting into, okay, was that legitimate? Was that a perfect, and in their eyes, it kind of was. We were going back and forth on it. I'm open to that conversation. My only point here is the fact that they have had many democratic leaders the fact that they've had a number of leaders in a short span of time doesn't mean that all of those leaders were elected democratically. And based on everything we're talking about, of course, doesn't mean they're good leaders. They can still be kleptocrats. They can still be using the power of the state to try to enrich themselves primarily, that kind of thing. That's just my pushback there, sir.
It's fair enough. That's a fair enough comment. Euromaidan did indicate wide divisions in Ukraine. And in fact, I think a poll taken at the time suggested it was supported by about 50% of the population. And in some respects, there was disaffection toward that in different parts of the east and south and in Crimea.
We're more Russophile, that had historically been closer to Russia, and that's part of the division is that the West had principally been closer to Europe for a longer period of time,
Yeah, but it changed. I mean, if you look at the electoral vote under Yushchenko, far more people voted for pro-Western policy than had been the case hitherto. So Yushchenko's influence prevailed right into the eastern part of Ukraine. And that was the exception, I think, because before that, you could divide Ukraine right down the Dnipro River. And that began to change. And even today, if you look at the Donbass, the western part of the Donbass failed to fall into that Russian sphere today. So you've got it split right down the middle. And I think that's the case in Ukraine. I mean, the anti-Russian sentiment in Ukraine, this is something I've monitored, has increased considerably since 2014. And I think that's inevitable, given the annexation of Crimea and given Russia's policy toward Ukraine, which is fairly patriarchal, I would say, at least, if not completely authoritarian. That's not to condone the Ukrainian political system or disagree, in fact, with your comments about the presidency, because I think the hierarchy in Ukraine is corrupt, and it's been corrupt for years. And nobody seems to be able to break that pattern. And every time you seem close to breaking it, then you get another leader who turns out to be less than expected. And I think Euromaidan was not the first such uprising in Ukraine. I think you'd have to go back to 1990 when there was the first massive demonstration in Maidan in Kiev. And then 2004 with the Orange Revolution against the election results of that year, and then 2014. And you can see how you might see the same situation develop again, some kind of mass uprising that begins. I think it begins against corruption. Whether it turns out that way by the end is another matter. So as you said, Euromaidan did turn violent at the end and effectively deposed an elected president 8 months before the end of his term.
Exactly. And whether you choose to, my point with that was, you were talking about democracy in Belarus versus and Russia versus here and the number of leaders they've elected. My point there was mainly the Euromaidan specifically, whether that's legitimate is in the eye of the beholder. As the 50% of people, polled, and I'd have to look at what you were talking about, but I would guess they were in Kiev, or that was the base of the polling. Whether that's representative, those are all questions that, valuable ones to have. And frankly, this whole conversation, just talking about Ukraine and what happened in Ukraine, because it could be such a flashpoint with Russia and has served as one, although not too dangerously, but, because that could accelerate into some sort of, much more outright regional war, having this conversation, sort of massaging this painful tissue, whatever it is, wherever you land on it, it's informative, and I'm glad we're having it.
Dr. Marples, before you go and before we close, has there been any response by Zelensky in regards to trying to explain any of this? I mean, I would imagine this is hitting the papers. And again, it's somewhat embarrassing for a person to get in on anti-corruption and looking magnificently corrupt. What has his excuse or explanations been to try to eschew blame from this?
Well, the only one I've seen is that it was a matter of protecting himself under the corrupt administration of Yanukovych, that he and his company felt threatened by Yanukovych, and in order to make sure that the government didn't take it over, they offloaded this money to offshore companies. So a matter of survival, in his words. But that's the only thing I've seen. And I went through pretty well the entire Ukrainian media yesterday looking for more information about that. And there was nothing. I mean, even this information I just narrated came from Western media. It didn't come from Ukraine. So I think the media in Ukraine is sort of hedging its bets. It's not quite sure where to go now. It's been heavily censored in recent times. As you probably know, the pro-Russian media has more or less been removed, particularly that of the oligarch Viktor Medvedchuk, who was very close to Vladimir Putin. His media has been more or less shut down in Ukraine. So let's say the more pro-Ukraine media has not really discussed this at all. So I think we're going to find out more in the coming days, but it's going to have a big impact.
Makes sense. It was great speaking with you. Thank you for joining us, David Marples. One quick question here as we take you out. You're the director of, what's the name of this program? The Stasiuk program? How do I say that?
The program was called the Stasiuk program. Actually, that's a little obsolete now because I don't have connections with the Ukrainian Institute anymore. I work on contemporary Ukraine, but my sole affiliation is with the history department now. So just to be accurate.
Okay, fair enough. Anyway, Dr. David Marples, thank you for joining us this morning. Great talking with you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And for those listening, that was Dr. David Marples, distinguished university professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we come back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. I see our lines are getting a little bit more crowded, but we still have room for more. Again, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We will be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda, but we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans talking about Assange and the Facebook whistleblower. Tarif, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Thanks for taking my call. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, free Denzinger, and hands off hate. I'm going to talk about the so-called whistleblower, Facebook whistleblower. They had an article came out by Post Millennial. It needed to be verified, but still no, I'm going to go ahead and explain what it's saying. That the woman that, Francis, that came out and blew the whistle, it seemed like she might have been, she's been represented by the press secretary, Jane Secchi, PR firm, and also they're saying in the article that she might have been receiving strategy help from Bill Bolton, that used to be press secretary underneath Obama White House. And so I don't know if this pans out, if it's true, then a testimony you can put an asterisk mark by a testimony.
Maybe. I don't know. I heard the thing about Psaki's PR firm. I also heard people talking about Eric Charmella, how his lawyers or his the law firm that he was using was also being used by her. But I don't know, man. The way I'm open to push back on this, but the way I feel about it, Washington can be a small place and the world can be a small place in some ways. You only have a small number of law firms and you're getting referred to those law firms. I don't know that that's enough to put an asterisk as if her testimony is all moot. Not that that's what you were saying exactly, but.
Okay, well, you do have a point on that one. So I'm going to go into the next story. WikiLeaks tweeted out something saying about, you remember when Mike, at the beginning of when it was last week, Mike Pompeo came out and said that 30 people need to be prosecuted and stuff like that. But basically, what WikiLeaks was saying that Mike Pompeo is should be accused of witness intimidation because he called for the prosecution of 30 sources who revealed Julian Assange's CIA kidnap plot, right? And also those 30 people is also witnesses. So I don't know how Julian Assange's team can do this. Maybe they can call, find out who they are and call them to testify in front of the judges if the judges will allow it to happen, which I don't think they would. But at least we got 30 witnesses that's on record now that Julian Assange have in his corner. Well, either they can testify over there in Britain or testify over here. We can try to get the man out and they force the GLJ to drop the charges. What y'all think about that?
Interesting idea. I don't know. My mind got stuck on Mike Pompeo, and partly because I was just checking out what he's been saying recently, and he's responded in a couple places to the Assange stuff. We were talking about that, but he hasn't been saying too much about it. Granted, there's other stuff going on. He's playing the Republican long political game, trying to appeal to Trump's base by saying mean things about Biden. That's what he's been up to, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
Any thoughts on what Tariq was saying there, Jamarl?
Tariq, I agree with you on the Julian Assange stuff, that all things being equal, let him go. I mean, it's been, 7 years or more at this point. It seems like they're basically torturing the man in broad public view. And honestly, it doesn't even seem that at this point, it's even unclear on what this trial is going to be about, considering that many of the witnesses have recanted. They don't have anything on him. Chelsea Manning is not going to testify against them. At this point, it seems like it's just torture for the sake of torture. So, yes, on that front, I absolutely agree. Let the man go.
Yes, torture for the sake of torture is about right. He's still serving his purpose.
Yeah,
getting flagellated by AUKUS, the U.S. and the UK intel establishments together. I guess I'm throwing Australia there for no good reason. Tarif, thank you for the call. Let's go to Michael, calling in from Silver Spring, talking about social media. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yeah, thanks. Basically, I just feel...
Michael, I think you might be on speakerphone. You're willing to switch to your headset?
Is this better?
That is a lot better. Thank you.
Okay. Basically, I feel like the internet was created originally, and then Facebook and these other social media organizations, mainly Facebook, they used the internet. They found out what the internet, the technology behind it, and then they basically leased it. So regarding privacy, Facebook controls a lot of information on people around the world, but the internet in of itself, in other words, the World Wide Web, when you go www. That is controlled by, who is that controlled by? That's my question for you.
That's one that I wonder about sometimes, and I'll be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I know that there are various regulatory authorities that handle specific things, like, for instance, the domain space, the namespace, relating your IP to any given subdomain. That's not www. That's the part that comes before. I'm talking about the part after, partly. But yeah, in terms of who controls the internet, I'm pretty sure it's a set of protocols that different countries will control in different ways as they're applied in their space. China can have its own internet infrastructure in place and then can pass laws and do things to control how the internet is regulated there. Same thing here in the United States. That's my understanding of it.
So this says no single person or organization controls the internet on its entirety. Like the global telephone network, no individual, company, or government can lay claim to the whole thing. However, lots of individuals, companies, and governments own certain bits of it. So yeah, I guess it's a conglomerate of pretty much everybody that has their own little stake in it that has the entirety or the totality.
Yes. Yeah. And a couple of things, you're talking about Facebook and Twitter almost as if they were creatures unto themselves. Facebook created by Mark Zuckerberg, Twitter created by Jack Dorsey, both these projects created by individual people that are backed by a bureaucracy at this point, with a bunch of different people making decisions about how these things are supposed to work. I'm just disambiguating Facebook, Twitter. These aren't creatures. These are composites of people's decisions. These are people coming together to make a bunch of decisions. But your more general point, which is the internet's a space, Facebook and Twitter have taken over these spaces in some sense. I kind of can see a point there. They don't just own their website. Their technologies they've created. Facebook, I forget the name of it. It was React. They created their own framework, like a JavaScript framework that a bunch of people use. That's Facebook's framework. Now, do they profit from that directly? I don't know about directly, but indirectly, they have a bunch of people in their ecosystem writing their kind of code that they can benefit from. That's one way that they've taken over the internet. Similarly,
Twitter also, especially we used to use Twitter's style sheet. Basically, Twitter has a pretty phenomenal style sheet in the way that they design their sites and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, they have their own like Bootstrap or something, isn't it?
Is it called Bootstrap? It may be called Bootstrap.
Something like that. Yeah,
it's something like that. But we used to use it all the time. I mean, it was just a fast way of putting styles and designs and text, look, coloring and everything else, curved surroundings and everything else. And so, yeah, I mean, their influence extends well beyond just their own typical site. It goes further into it.
Yeah,
React it became
exactly
big. Our company even started using
React. I believe it is Bootstrap with Twitter. The point being, that's one type of control they have. That's like, a very small type of control. You could also, I'm going to turn to Google for a second here, but of course, if Google's pointing people not to other websites, not with their search engine, with people who are doing searches, but instead back into their own ecosystem of news and shops and everything else, then that's a kind of control they're able to exert. So I take the general point, Michael, and I agree with you on the general point, which is these companies have made moves to take it over. But on the other hand, you also have like internet service providers, ISPs, different entities that can also gate it. If you're running your app on Amazon Web Services, those are servers basically owned by Amazon that you can, they'll lease out to you. You can put stuff there, maybe even run applications, software on them, whatever. That's that's controlled by Amazon. That's Amazon's territory. But a lot of other people, they can just turn you off. Yeah, like happened with Parler.
Yeah,
when the Parler wasn't doing what all these companies wanted them to do. So increasingly, we are sort of leasing these spaces, leasing frameworks, leasing opportunities, because these big companies have made these spaces. They're so easy to use, and now they rent them to us, and they do control a lot of what we put online. Increasingly, instead of having your own blog that you install from WordPress or whatever, people will use a Substack, or they'll use Twitter, they'll use social media applications. In other words, they'll use these platforms. So this is a kind of control. I'm fleshing the idea out because Michael does have a point there, and it's worth being said.
Yeah, it is control. I mean, it's gotten to the point where it's become so influential in regards to business, in regards to communication, that I don't even know if there's a way around that. I mean, short of some kind of, direct legislation that allows, people more autonomy or more control over their own content and whatnot. But at this point, you have the social media companies as our commons that we don't necessarily own.
Yes.
Brave.
He is not on. Oh. He just dropped because we were just talking.
Oh, okay.
He was running out of time, and so I respect the decision. Brave. Anyway, we're just talking about this stuff.
I respect his decision. Well, call back Brave at the end of 9 o'clock.
I believe he will.
All right, guys. Well, look, here's the thing now. I don't know if there's any way around that. Meaning, the moment that you try to create a space, let's say for a moment it wasn't on the internet space, just land and territory. Well, you're going to get companies to build whatever they build, to supply whatever they supply. You're going to get people who are reliant upon whatever they supply in order to live and kind of propagate themselves. And then at some point, ideally, you would think there would be laws to regulate how they do what they do. I don't necessarily think the internet is any different. It is, but maybe just in the contours or grand contours of things.
This is something else that came to mind, which is why I felt like getting into this issue, because there's actually lots to talk about with it. You've done web development stuff. Do you remember Web 2.0? Do you remember this as a thing? So Web 1.0, you'd have HTML and CSS. Web 2.0, they started to add in more CSS animations, and you could use JavaScript with CSS in these ways, where people were creating these new kinds of websites that were dynamic and responsive and doing these interesting things. Web 2.0 was this thing that swept over web development. Now there's Web 3.0, which is a recent move to integrate like DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations, to integrate Ethereum, to integrate cryptocurrencies, basically.
Oh, I see.
Into web use and to change the protocols and stuff. I could see that being a next wave. In fact, a lot of people are talking about it as if it is the next wave of the internet. Now, what's the ownership of that going to look like? It'll probably look different. I think that's where that conversation goes, at least right now. There is another way of doing it. It's going to have some similarities, some of the same problems, but you see what I'm saying. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning's show. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Alrighty, good morning again, everybody. It's just past 9 a.m. Eastern here on the East Coast, and it's October 6th. And without further ado, let's get into the headlines. We've got COVID stats. First up, yesterday in the United States, there were 98,506 new COVID cases reported. There were also 1,808 deaths reported here in the U.S. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 102,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 24% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 56% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 65% of residents have received at least one dose of a vaccine in the U.S. And as of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 43,925,000 people across the United States and killed 705,394 people here in the U.S. In national news, Joe Biden has stated that the Democrats could change the filibuster rules in order to raise the debt ceiling. We should come back to this one tomorrow. I feel like we've talked about this one sufficiently this morning. Former White House Chief of Staff under Trump, Mark Meadows, and other top aides have been subpoenaed by the House committee looking into the January 6th riot. An inside source says that these people are planning to defy the order and refuse to surrender over documents and other files to the committee. I don't know, man. It just seems pretty silly. They're just... Seems like the House committee looking into this is just trying to stir the pot on this one. Okay, let's keep this train rolling. We can't let January 6th die, even though their FBI informants who were part of the Proud Boys going into this said there was no top-down plan. We haven't seen any sign of top-down plan. Granted, you do want due diligence when there's literally a raid on the Capitol building. That's not an insignificant event. On the other hand, I can also see how they're trying to make hay by delaying the length of the sun's beautiful rays on this crop or whatever. They're wanting to
keep hitting Republicans.
Want to keep hitting it.
Yeah.
They want this to be a drip, drip, drip story where they're constantly able to add some new event to keep people's attention on it.
I got to be honest. At the point where you have FBI informants who are embedded and they're saying, yeah, this wasn't planned. This wasn't, because if you're going with the idea that it's planned, why didn't informants know about the plan? And why didn't the FBI know about the plan? It looks dicey at a certain point. I mean, you can't really have it both ways.
And if the dude who's planning it, that would have been the head of the Proud Boys, who is himself an FBI informant.
Yeah.
Well, what?
You would think that information would have ferreted down somewhere along the way where these guys would have gotten wind of it.
Yes.
And so it becomes, okay, well, if the FBI had informants and didn't say anything about it, well, that looks bad on the FBI. But the FBI is basically saying, yeah, these guys didn't necessarily seem that this was large, concerted, overwhelming effort to do this. It seemed like it was a bunch of yahoos that got excited and decided to raid the Capitol on the fly.
It is true. It is true. Continuing on with more headlines here, President Biden told reporters yesterday that he had discussed Taiwan in his phone call with China's President Xi Jinping last month. He stated the two came to terms and, quote, will abide by the Taiwan agreement, end quote. This is referring to a long-standing diplomatic understanding that the U.S. recognizes Beijing as the sole legal government of China without clarifying the United States' position on Taiwanese sovereignty. Strategic ambiguity, as I think you put it last hour. Yesterday, some 1,400 employees went on strike at Kellogg's cereal plants all over America. Union president accused the cereal company of, quote, demanding workers give up health care and retirement benefits and holiday and vacation pay, end quote. Kellogg's spokesperson, Chris Boehner, said the company offers benefits and compensation among the best in the industry. The Biden administration is moving to relax the rules for a student loan forgiveness program. The program will erase all remaining debt as long as the student or teacher makes 10 years of payments consistently. Previously, 90% of applicants have been rejected for this program. According to the administration, more than 550,000 borrowers will move closer to forgiveness. That's a big one for a lot of people with student loans. Then you just got to pay consistent payments for 10 years. 10 years.
Decade.
And it's all gone. Yeah, but this was like a lifelong burden for a lot of people. Now, you got a 10-year plan for getting out of this, right?
Yeah.
you also have to pay tax on it. Here's the thing, though, man. I've heard a lot of people with like extensive student loan debt who are like, okay, how they're playing the games internally. How do I do this? What's the plan here? And a lot of them were like, I wish I could do this program. I wish, because I can make 10 years of consistent payments well under what the value of the loan is. I'll give you a couple $100 every month, whatever it's going to be.
Are you sure they allow it to be under the value of the loan?
Oh, well, that's the thing.
That's the catch. I seriously doubt it is. I mean, and keep in mind, oftentimes this would be people haunting people even to their old age.
Oh, yeah.
They would cut their Social Security checks if they don't necessarily pay.
Yeah, but
you have taxes.
School's great, isn't it, Jamarl?
School is great.
No,
the way the government is dealing with it is the problem.
Wow.
I mean, if you're in some other country, let's say Germany or somewhere else, it is a vital interest of the public for those people to be able to get an education. And the United States basically holds it over their heads and says, hey, you want this degree? Give me money. Give me thousands and thousands of dollars for this. It's appalling the way we do it. We should, cherish education, not necessarily have this thing where we're penalizing people for their temerity to get an education. It's horrendous. And by the way, Joe Biden does have power to get rid of this. I mean, this is what they've been hitting him on for God knows how long, where Chuck Schumer is like, get rid of the money, get rid of 50,000, get rid of 50,000. And Joe Biden is like, I don't know if I can do that. I don't know if I have powers to do that. It's like, dude, Donald Trump was basically using his own authority to postpone the time frame in which the money is being paid back. Joe Biden was using his presidential authority to postpone the money because it's coming from the Department of Education. This is a choice that he's making. And yeah, 90%. Basically, they created a program where the overwhelming majority couldn't participate.
Couldn't get it.
Yeah.
Well, and granted, I don't think we've already talked about it. In international news, natural gas prices have risen by nearly 400% since the beginning of the year all over Europe. British wholesale gas has seen a 23% increase at gas pumps, not nearly as large as 400%. In tech news, a group of 20 Blue Origin employees got together and penned an essay listing numerous safety concerns and other concerns with the company. Overall, the company, quote, they say, values the optics of Jeff Bezos over the safety of its rockets, end quote. Well, that is bad for Jeff Bezos' optics, I'll say that much, that statement. The employees recounted how they were getting pressure to go faster rather than smarter every step of the way. Many could not even watch the launch in July because the speed at which the program was run meant the possibilities of many things going wrong. In other words, they couldn't actually pay attention to the launch. They were otherwise occupied, distracted, that kind of thing. In conclusion, the employees believe it is only a matter of time before the rockets explode. They said they would not set foot on one. And that is the ultimate damning indictment. Some of the people who built these things saying, well, I wouldn't get in it. I wouldn't touch it.
I'm waiting for Elon Musk to put that on his Facebook page or his Twitter page now.
Oh, yeah.
And be like, this is horrendous. You need to, you couldn't go all in.
Yeah, oh, yeah. Well, and you remember just the other day we were saying Musk giving Bezos grief for the lawsuits. You can't sue your way to the moon.
Right.
And now can you even fly your way to the moon in one of those things? A rickety tin can of a rocket ship. Gold lined just to make Jeff Bezos a little bit more impressive, but it won't fly more than about 20 feet. No, I'm being too critical. In Earth and Science news, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry has been given to Benjamin List and David McMillan this year for their simultaneous development of the model of organocatalysis back in the year 2000, basically creating a third class of catalysts, artificial ones this time. In the wake of the California oil spill this past weekend, California lawmakers are pushing to ban all offshore oil drillings. The spill dumped around 126,000 gallons of crude oil into the ocean. NASA is set to launch DART. That's an Armageddon-style mission to deliberately crash into an asteroid the day before Thanksgiving. The spacecraft is aimed to hit Didymos and its moonlet Dimorphos. NASA is deeming this, quote, the first test for planetary defense, end quote. And yes, it's a test. It's not an actual practical application. Because tomorrow we got into this brief, moral
wait a minute, why are they doing that?
Why are they doing this? Is there something? Are we about to become the dinosaurs, if not but for the success of this mission? I don't think so. In business news, Saudi Aramco hit a $2 trillion valuation. This puts Aramco just behind Microsoft and Apple as the world's most valuable company. And with all that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Wait, the holidays got changed. Austin, are you introducing a new batch of holidays for each hour?
Yes, it is.
Today is National Mad Hatter Day. It is also World Cerebral Palsy Day. And it's National Coaches Day. Coaches are important.
Yeah.
But Jamarl, I wanted to come back. I said we should hit this. We should hit this. Yes, Austin says there were a lot for today. Apparently, America, just in general, there are a lot of holidays out there. You gave the full list a little while back, and I just skipped them. I just couldn't handle it. You gave a full list of them. There were like 10 different holidays, and I was like, I can't process this, man. I'm sorry. But the debt ceiling, and the conversation over changing the filibuster. Because can you just set this up for people? Basically, there's this debt ceiling debate between Democrats and Republicans, broadly speaking, where the Republicans don't want to raise the debt ceiling, but they're also using that whole conversation, as they always do, as leverage in negotiations that are ongoing. Right. And then in order to get this across the finishing line, Biden's saying, well, maybe we need to change how the filibuster works. Right. What specific changes does he want there?
Yeah, so I don't know the specific changes that Biden wants. I mean, basically, to be able to do this with 51 votes, Mitch McConnell and Republicans are basically going to filibuster raising the debt ceiling, which is astonishing. I mean, to put it in perspective, the debt ceiling is basically bills that the country or that the Congress has already appropriated. We are going to go and spend X on these programs or this particular thing, whether it's COVID, whether it's anything else. But there's this also other quirk in government that even though Congress, appropriates money for whatever, Congress controls the purse strings, they still have to come behind and approve the debt ceiling, whatever that amount, and either raise it or suspend it to allow those monies to be paid. Republicans started to use this under Obama in order to try to force, let's say, force concessions. I mean, right off the bat, if the debt ceiling, if the full faith and credit of the United States is basically challenged or basically blown away by us not paying our bills or running over it, well, man, you're talking about millions of jobs being lost, trillions of dollars being lost almost on a whim, the amount of money that the United States pays to service its debt going through the roof. Not to mention a global recession at that point because the United States and its economic might. And so the Republicans are basically playing around with, the global economic future on some level. When Obama gets out of office, Trump gets in office, they raise it by $9 trillion, on a whim, just out of the blue. Well, now we're in a situation where Democrats are back in office again, and Republicans are saying, yeah, we're not going to touch that. We're not going to raise that. Democrats should just raise it with budget reconciliation. And of course, Democrats don't want to do that because they don't want to come across as if, well, we are spending this cash and we are taking this responsibility on all to ourselves, especially since the bills were basically made by both parties, because we were talking about stuff that was already done, especially around COVID. And so Biden is like, well, maybe we need to go with the filibuster. We need to do something about that filibuster. That was something that Biden wasn't for. Here's the other quirk. Biden, during, I forget which administration, I think it was Bush's administration, ended up voting against raising the debt ceiling himself. Biden voted against raising the debt ceiling himself, basically saying, I don't want this on my conscience, or I don't want anything that this president has been doing basically on my conscience, so I'm going to make this vote against raising the debt ceiling. And so Mitch McConnell kind of brought that back to his attention recently, saying, hey, remember when you did exactly the same thing? In that particular case, though, there wasn't any kind of fear of the debt ceiling not necessarily being raised. In this case, the party, even Mitt Romney, by the way, who is supposed to be, quote unquote, a moderate and is kind of the bellwether or the canary in the coal mine on this, these guys are unified, saying, we're not raising it. You got to do it on your own or not at all. And where the rubber meets the road is, are they willing to do that? And are Democrats going to try to push this through budget reconciliation? Now, Joe Manchin has basically poo-pooed the idea of getting rid of the filibuster. And so Manchin has made the point of saying, no, we can do this through budget reconciliation. So that's essentially where we are with that. But the fact that Biden brings up the filibuster when Biden was initially not on board for getting rid of it once before, interesting. And again, I don't know what changes he wants to it. I mean, is he talking about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where the person has to just stand there, as opposed to saying, yeah, I'm going to filibuster that, and then they go back and get a coffee? Or is he meaning no?
They got to talk.
Right, they got to talk.
Talking.
48 hours standing there, water and everything else. People can give you massages or whatever while you're standing up, but you got to stand there.
Filibustering, it's a performance sport.
Yeah,
when it's done, when it's done the right way.
Yeah, pretty much. And look, I would be all for that. If McConnell wants to filibuster whatever, there should be some kind of cost in it. In doing so, I mean, personally, I would say get rid of it as an entirety. But there seems to be, not necessarily the votes to do that. And Sinema, Manchin, I would imagine there are probably a few other Democrats, especially moderates, that aren't going to be on board for it. And I don't even think Biden is on board for that.
Well, it's good for insomnia. You switch over, you can't sleep. It's 3 a.m. You switch to C-SPAN,
and the guy's just standing there, just reading Humpty Dumpty.
Rand Paul is going crazy at 3 a.m. He's had about 8 coffees, and he's talking about the Fed.
And by the way, you can read anything. I mean, like you could sit there and read Moby Dick if you want.
Oh, you know, yeah.
War and Peace.
The point is just to stand and talk.
Just stand up and talk.
You just keep the floor. No, I get it. I get the idea. Thank you for unpacking it. I handed it over to you because obviously you know this stuff a bit better than I do, and I thought you'd give a good, albeit, you know, you got your own perspective.
Yeah,
we go back and forth in the debt ceiling and stuff like that, but still.
Yeah, I totally think they should get rid of the filibuster. I mean, because you have this 50 vote. I mean, the filibuster is not this aspect of the Constitution. It's this kind of quirk that was basically added into it. And so you have this thing now where any and everything, it's one thing if you had good faith actors on both sides, where, okay, we get that we lost 51 votes, the majority of things we'll give you that. But at this point, everything takes 60 votes, which is obscene. The Senate is already a minority body. I mean, whether it's California, which is like the 5th largest economy in the world, if it was a state in and of itself, I mean, a country in and of itself, and Idaho or Iowa, both 2 senators, meaning even like it's a leveling factor in our politics. It's the thing that slows down any kind of thing trying to get things passed. And that's even without the filibuster, just because you have 2 people from each state. I mean, the moment that you add in a filibuster and you have the 60-vote threshold, everything becomes nearly impossible. I mean, they're basically using budget reconciliation for things that budget reconciliation wasn't necessarily designed to be used for, because under normal circumstances, where they'll be able to just kind of have a floor vote, 51 gets it, you move on, that is off the table from here on out. So yeah, it's creating this kind of just weirdness in our politics where, you know, less and less and less gets done.
Sounds productive.
Yeah. But, and look, I get the argument that people make, well, yeah, we don't want flailing back and forth. Like one party gets in and then all of a sudden everything is changed overnight. And then the next party gets in 4 years or 8 years and everything is changed overnight. And it's kind of, I don't think it'll work that way. I mean, Republicans had the ability to House and the Senate. They weren't able to get rid of Obamacare. They weren't able to get rid of Social Security. There were certain things that it was politically disadvantageous for them to basically trespass on. I think the same thing would basically hold true. And maybe, honestly, if more stuff got done, you may even have a situation where people were more interested in the political space where a particular party may gain more prominence in, you know, ruling and governing. I don't know. I get aggravated, though, that it seems like anything or trying to get anything done is basically stuck to this notion of a 60-vote threshold that was not supposed to be there. And then it just got worse and worse and worse as, okay, now you don't have to stand up. Now you can just put a finger in the air, and that's enough to say you're filibuster, meaning there's no cost in filibustering. Even they used to even have it where the moment that there was a filibuster, all of the policy had to stop. Meaning the only thing that you can focus on is this one track for the filibuster. So if you filibuster this, everything stops. Well, then they start having multiple tracks. So you can have this thing being filibustered and this thing being filibustered and this thing being filibustered while you talk about something else. It just made, it's like one choice after the next just made it that much worse. And so, yeah, something needs to be done. Will they do it? Doesn't seem like it.
I don't know. They've gotten used to the logjam.
Yeah.
They're using them as stairs at this point or something like that.
Yeah.
But literally the means, you know, this backstop option for handling things has become the default.
Yeah.
And now they've modified the default, you know, this new default to make it easier to do the thing that you should never have been doing with it in the first place.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Anyway, we've got to take it into a break. We got our guest on the line. Don't want to delay him too much. We're going to be rejoined by Peter Oliver. Yes. Talking to Peter Oliver again about a lot more. There's just there's been stuff we've had building up, news building up.
Because he was ill. We had an opportunity to talk to him.
Exactly. The poor guy. Anyway, we'll be back with Peter Oliver, great guest, frequent one on the show. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be talking about the spat going down between France and the UK. Also, John Kerry and Antony Blinken going out to smooth over the relationship between France and the United States after the last couple of weeks of stress and hair being pulled out, all that stuff. Anyway, we'll be back joined by Peter Oliver on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So there's a spat that's going on between the UK and France. It is pretty petty Betty when you look at it, but both powers are basically using the leverage at their disposal to get what they want. In France's case, it wants more fishing licenses. It believes that the UK has not been giving the quantity of fishing licenses that it needs. Out of 47 French vessels that applied for permit, only 12 got licenses, something that France says is uncalled for, or at the very least unacceptable. And France, to their part, has basically started saying, hey, that's a pretty nice island you got there. It'll be a shame if you go in the dark, because they're basically threatening the energy supply for the UK, because the UK is a net importer of energy. And France and the EU, or has been pushing the EU, to get more hawkish on this notion of potentially cutting off that energy in relation or in response to the fishing rights. To have a conversation about this, we're joined with the one and only Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, welcome back. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is an interesting one.
It is an interesting one.
It gets a lot worse before it gets better.
Yeah, I was sitting here thinking to myself, it was like, we've been, for the longest time, I remember Theresa May, they would say, hey, Theresa May, what does Brexit mean? Brexit means Brexit. Brexit means Brexit. She was saying this for like 2 or 3 years. And now I think we're finally seeing, what does Brexit mean? Brexit means stuff like this. So did I relay that story correctly? And please, embellish on it. What is going on in this spat, and how serious has this gotten?
Right. If you were to look at a map for the Channel Islands, they are British Crown dependencies that are, for all intents and purposes, part of the United Kingdom. If you look what surrounds them, they are surrounded by the Channel, as their name would suggest, but they're also surrounded by France. These are pretty much islands right off the coast of France that belongs to the UK. They rely on France for all of their power. The port that is used, the port on Jersey, one of the main Channel Islands, it was used extensively by French fishermen. Now, the French fishing boats have been applying for new licenses, or have had to apply for these new licenses post-Brexit in order to land fish there and to do what they need to do, and actually what they've been doing for years and years and years. The UK has only given, 2 weeks ago, they only gave 12 licenses out of 47 vessels that applied for them. Last week, only a third of French boats that applied for licenses got them, and that has seen this step up a little bit. Now, it would be it's wrong to say the nuclear option, but, let's do it anyway. It would be the nuclear option. We are talking quite a lot about nuclear power when it comes to France, of course, but it would be the nuclear option to say that they're going to cut off power to the whole of the United Kingdom. What we may very well see, though, is power get cut off to the Channel Islands, because the Channel Islands rely on France for their power. In fact, the Jersey Electric Company are currently going through a lot of talks with the French side at the moment to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. But we are seeing politicians, not just, fringe politicians. We're talking about senior members of the cabinet here. France's Prime Minister, Jean Castex, saying, if they basically, I'm going to paraphrase him massively, but if you keep doing this, there will be consequences. And those consequences will be, first off, the Channel Islands will have its power cut off.
Wow.
And then in order for France to actually cut off the power it gives to mainland UK, There's quite a lot of steps before it would get to that. It would be highly unlikely that would happen, but France does provide the UK with power that powers around 3 million British homes every single year. Now, these are by 2 cables that go under the channel. The stages that would come would be if France was to cut off power to the Channel Islands, you would then see major arbitration taking place. The EU would be heavily involved in that. But it is possible.
And just so we're clear,
this theoretically possible that France could cut that off, but they would be, for them to act unilaterally without the EU and without it going through arbitration processes, that would be incredibly unlikely. Yeah. But what this does show is that outside of the group, outside of the EU, it's up to the UK to fend for itself. And when it comes to doing it with regards to France, it's not doing particularly well because it comes down to things that were promised during that Brexit campaign. There was a lot of talk about taking back control of numerous different things, but fishing was front and centre for what both Boris Johnson, what the Leave campaign, what they said they were going to do was put fishing rights in the hands of the British. Well, they've done that, but what they haven't realised is there's repercussions for denying people rights to fish in waters that they fished in for an awfully long time.
Yeah, they're consequences.
You're now hearing the French say, we're not going to stand for it. And, if you rely on somebody for power, they're now the ones saying, look, we've got this hanging over you. We could use it against you.
That's a heavy pressure point. And, to be clear, this is during a time where energy costs are spiking. Britain had an issue with petrol. I mean, where they basically, if I'm not mistaken, brought in the military in order to ensure that the service stations had oil and, again, just talking about energy. And so, I mean, this is a pretty severe threat, to put it mildly. I mean, how do you think they would actually go through with this? I mean, I know the fishing boat issue, like you said, France is going to look out for their interests. And France has basically been pushing the European Union to be more belligerent towards the UK. Especially since it seems that Bojo has not necessarily lived up to all of the agreements that were made during Brexit. Are they serious about this? And would the EU go along with this if France is, again, pushing? And one more thing. This kind of goes to this whole notion of what is the European Union with Angela Merkel stepping down if France gains a higher prominence? Does that just mean more bellicosity towards the UK?
Right. Are they serious? Yes. This is being taken incredibly seriously because when it comes to matters of fishing and agriculture, the French don't mess around. And there is an election next year in France. The last thing anybody wants who's trying to run for office is fishermen upset. When fishermen get upset, the agricultural workers get upset as well. And what do the French like to do? They love to protest and strike. And when they do it, they make a statement. They make a statement that is heard not just in the areas where they are, but particularly in central Paris. So are the French government serious about wanting to do something about this? Yes, they very much are. Will it get to the stage whereby 3 million homes in Britain have to find alternative power sources? We would be seeing real serious issues in the relationship, which would have broken down to levels that it still isn't at yet, even though this is a relationship that is about as degraded as it's been. I mean, I heard a brilliant way of summing up the way the UK and France are, is that they're basically the geopolitical equivalent of neighbours that have been having a decades-long row over a tree that overhangs a fence. And the letters have gone backwards and forwards between various lawyers for as long as people can remember. It's still nowhere near getting sorted out, and it will continue for as long as anybody can remember. I mean, there is still a sentiment, and it's particularly strong amongst those that would be massively thinking that Brexit is going in the right way, that if it's upsetting the French, we must be doing the right thing. But that is a very simplistic way of looking at it. And it is a huge, huge issue at the moment over the relationship of where does the UK fit in right now? Yeah. Because it's left, if you think of it as a divorce, it's left the EU, I beg your pardon, in very acrimonious terms, in very acrimonious way. There are huge problems over the Northern Ireland Protocol that the UK side negotiated, which now says that they don't want anything to do with, it needs to be renegotiated.
Which is a non-starter.
Causing huge. This absolute non-starter. You mentioned the petrol issue, the issue at gas stations in the UK. Now, there isn't a shortage of fuel for cars in the UK. What there is a shortage of people to drive the trucks to get it from where it is to the forecourts of the gas stations, because there's a shortage of lorry drivers, of truck drivers, because the vast majority of those people who were doing the driving, they came from the European Union and were working there as EU citizens working in another EU member state. Following Brexit, they now no longer have the right to do that. That's why you've got huge shortfalls in the number of truck drivers, which is having catastrophic consequences when it comes to the supply of petrol. We said that there's soldiers involved in getting petrol to petrol stations at the moment in the United Kingdom. The military have been involved there. You're also seeing huge problems with agriculture and farming sectors that have knock-on effects from Brexit. There's talk about, I think it's 120,000 pigs that are going to have to be slaughtered, that won't make it into the food chain because of the hold-ups that have been caused, that ran a roundabout way come from Brexit. Then there's the whole situation with where does the UK stand now geopolitically? Boris Johnson has done his best in recent weeks to attach himself as firmly to Joe Biden and the United States as he possibly can. But what you've then saw is, of course, the AUKUS situation with the submarine treaty that saw France again left in the lurch. That caused problems with the relationship between the UK and France again. So you've got everywhere you turn more and more problems when it comes to the UK's relationship with its nearest neighbours. Now, will it end up with the lights going out for 3 million homes? I don't think so. But what you are going to, and what you also have is, and I think it's increasingly frustrating people on the European side of the argument, is that they will put, well, we're all Europeans, but the EU side of the argument is that they are constantly saying, this is the situation that you negotiated. Mm-hmm. And then there seems to be a belief amongst the current UK government that nobody in the rest of nobody in the EU can either read or understand English, because they then go on TV and radio and write in newspapers saying, we're going to show Johnny Foreigner. Now, this is what Castier said in Parliament just yesterday in France. He said, like, look, they tell us they're going to do one thing, and then they go and they badmouth us left, right, and centre, and they say they're not going to do this for us, and they're going to show them and everything like that. And it plays well. It plays well with the domestic audience in the United Kingdom, but in terms of being a way to develop a constructive and a pragmatic foreign policy to neighbours that you need to have a good relationship with, it's not the way to be going about it. And it seems to be, this is where we seem to be coming up with problems in just about every single sector, because there were shortages of food on supermarket shelves, which all comes, and a lot of it comes down to simple things like, well, why could we do this a year ago and we can't do this now? Yeah. Well, the reason you could do it a year ago is because you still had freedom of movement as the Brexit transition period was still in place. And you can't do it now because in many ways the transition period has ended. We're still not actually in full Brexit yet. We still don't know exactly what the repercussions of this will be. But what you certainly do not need is a whole load of French fishermen upset with the UK, thinking the UK is trying to enact some kind of new rural Britannia type policy, which would then ultimately perhaps see those fishermen start blockading British ports. And if that happens, you're going to see these type of shortages get worse and worse and worse in the United Kingdom. So that's and when it comes to how you asked about how is this affected by what happens with Angela Merkel stepping down, I think the French have let slip that already, and they are on this particular issue, whether it's Emmanuel Macron or whether it's Michel Barnier, who you may remember from Brexit negotiation terms, he's running to be president next time around. He's running on very much an agenda of, we're going to show Britain what for.
We're going to wrap Britain on the knuckles. So what exactly do they want the European Union to do to Britain in this case? I mean, it seems like Britain is already catching it. I remember one of the issues during the negotiation had to do with if Britain basically falters and become this kind of hell state on the side of the coast of the EU, that it would somehow reflect poorly on the EU. I mean, it seems that this is where they're headed, though. I mean, this seems to get worse and worse as time goes on. And not to mention, I remember one of the saddest things that I saw recently was that the UK was thinking about switching the metric system to U.S. standards of measurement, which is like, why are you doing that?
Now they would say that you use the old imperial method measurements. This is the thing: is that it is called the imperial measurement system in the UK. It was it's an interesting one. I'm 38 years old. So I went to high school in 1994, graduated high school in 2001, off the top of my head. What that means is I can't tell you how many centimeters are in a foot, but I do know all about meters, kilometers, milliliters, liters, and everything like that.
The metric system.
But I know the metric system. I do not know the old imperial system, but there is, of course, generations above me that they had to change everything, and for many they want to go back to it. And it's, in some ways, you're right, this is a little bit, if that's all that you're going to get from Brexit, is that you're going to get a blue-black passport that no longer allows you to live and work in 27 other actually, it's more than that if you include all of the other ones. It's basically, that allows you to go live and work in a whole load of other countries. And, you know, you're also going to get the fact that you can, I mean, nobody stopped calling it a pint when you ordered a beer in a pub, just because it was, you had to technically serve it in the milliliter version of it. Yeah. It's never been such a huge issue. I mean, the UK also does its speed limits in miles per hour. Distances tend to be conducted in miles rather than kilometers, but short distances, short measurements in centimeters and millimeters. If these are the victories that you're going to get and have caused what may well be untold amounts of damage to your economy, to your national reputation, and to the general life of your citizens, it is looking more and more like an act of self-harm, Brexit. But there would be those that say we've got them just where we want them.
Yeah, this is pretty bleak, very bleak, to put it mildly. And so we had, which is the French speakers in this country, Blinken and I believe John Kerry. Yes. So what's the say-so on this one? I mean, were they able to smooth over the rough edges of the AUKUS deal, or for the most part, is France still very, very angry at the U.S. and the UK?
France is very, very angry, but there has been a rapprochement, which is a lovely word to say, somewhat after the visit of Antony Blinken and John Kerry as well, doing the best PR campaign that they possibly could. I mean, you had Tony Blinken there speaking French on French TV, saying we could and should have communicated better. We sometimes take for granted a relationship as important as the one that we have between France and the United States. So I can't speak French, but that has been a little bit of a mea culpa, mea maxima culpa from, to go to my Latin, from the US Secretary of State as he met with colleagues in France. They're still not happy about it. What actually gets done in order to really smooth things over, we may well find out later this month because President Biden will be heading to Europe. There is a big meeting between himself and Emmanuel Macron set, and yeah, you're going to see some kind of deal. I don't think it's going to be as naked as a, hey, look, one of our I don't want to say dependencies or one of our, but basically a country that we have huge sway over has just decided they're going to buy a whole load of your submarines. I don't think it's going to be as naked as that, but there will be some quid pro quo, to go back to my Latin again, so in order to allow face to be saved. Because it got bad, you know. Let's not gloss over that at all. The idea of France withdrawing its ambassador to the United States, that's not as bad as things get. So there was certainly a huge amount of upset on the French side that did translate to an extent. I think it was interesting to see when you talk about, is France going to become the de facto leader of the EU post-Merkel? Well, I think you got to see just how far the EU as a bloc is willing to back France if Paris decides it's going to make these type of decisions, because you had Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, coming out initially and saying, we're on the side with France here. But then when it got to the idea of talk of betrayal and you can't treat us this way and the absolute outrage, it got reined back a little bit. So there was support for France against the way it was treated by the United States and by Australia, and to a lesser degree by the United Kingdom in that particular spat. But yeah, they didn't go all in on their support for Paris in that particular issue. But so I guess later this month we'll find out exactly just how well that's gone. But what we certainly are going to see is a lot more talk about energy, a lot more talk, particularly about gas prices as well. What's going on between not just France, but its role within the EU at the moment.
Makes sense. And coming back to what Blinken was saying there, your translation of it, basically, we took you for granted. That is actually it's a very effective conversational tactic. I'm sorry, I took you for granted, that kind of thing. Granted, you don't want somebody to keep on saying that. But the implication there, of course, is we are close enough. I'm sorry, we're so close. We're too close. To the point where I've sort of overlooked how close we are. Well, now I'm sorry about that. Let's get back to being very close. It assumes some intimacy that may unravel. That's obviously what we're talking about. But one thing, I wanted to move to the note you sent over earlier this morning about the traffic light coalition in Germany. But you were talking about quid pro quo with the U.S. maybe convincing another independent nation to do business here with France, and that calming France down a bit. I had heard some people saying similar things about the Greek deal that was already approved basically between France and Greece, with France selling Greece not just, I believe it was between 6 and 8 warships, but also doubling their purchase of aircraft. I'd heard some people saying that was the United States, a basically U.S. brokered deal, that they had approved that, again, as an attempt to make up to France for forcing Australia effectively, or whatever it was, pushing Australia with this other deal to pull out of their one with France. Had you heard anything about that having to do with Greece, or is that truly out of left field, Peter? It would make an awful lot of sense because they have to, as I said, there has to be something. And the fact that if you were then to be selling naval ships to Greece, I'm sure Greece needs naval ships, particularly in its increasing role in Frontex as part of the European Union's border patrol. The increasing role that Greece has there. They're going to need those. France can supply them. If the US helped to broker that, I'm sure it would have helped to smooth over some of those cracks. It wouldn't be surprising. It was exactly done that way. I wouldn't be surprised. Can't tell you one way or the other. Exactly. That's where I just wanted to do a sort of reality check, because I'm in my bubble. But let's move to the Traffic Light Coalition. You sent a note over earlier this morning. This is a potential new German government after the German elections, as the parties are, of course, coming together to try to figure out who's going to be the chancellor. What's this government going to look like? What are its policies going to look like? Now, this is one of the the Traffic Light Coalition that you're talking about. It's the SDP, the Social Democrats, teaming up with the Greens, and then the Yellows, the Libertarians, sort of Free Democrats is how I take them. And you put it as a chancellor backed up by green-flavored neoliberalism. That would be one variation. The other main variation would be the CDU, CSU, working with the Greens, the Free Democrats, the Greens, and the Yellows, basically, to come up with something. But you're saying this seems more likely. This is what you're talking about. These are the talks right now. What would this look like, Peter? So let's start with what it looks like we're not going to have first. You talked about a traffic light coalition. We'll come to that in a moment. The one that it doesn't look like we're going to get is called the Jamaica Coalition. That's the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Social Union, the Greens, and the Free Democrats. It's called the Jamaica Coalition. Their colours make up the colours of the Jamaican flag. That looks dead and buried right now. It does look like after 16 years in power, the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Social Union are going to have a bit of time in opposition. They were, of course, Angela Merkel's party. So what we've heard come out on Wednesday morning was that after these discussions between ultimately the kingmakers, which would be the two lesser parties, the two minor parties in the coalition, if it was to come about, which would be the Greens and the Free Democrats, they've been holding talks for the last
few days, since before the weekend, I think, in fact, and have decided that there are things that they can agree on. So if they can agree on something, they can be the building blocks to decide ultimately, do we have a centre-left chancellor or a centre-right chancellor, either a Social Democrat chancellor or a CDU-CSU chancellor. Now, the Greens have come out this morning and said they are very willing to talk to the Social Democrats about putting together a traffic light coalition. What that means is somebody has had to sell out something they campaigned very heavily on. We don't know who sold out what. We don't know who's agreed what. But what you would ultimately have is what I sent you as a message earlier on. It's going to be, a social democratic chancellor in Olaf Scholz, the current vice chancellor and finance minister. But it would be built on a bedrock of a union that doesn't seem that doable, but then when you really look at the two parties, it makes a lot of sense. Between the Greens, who are, of course, a environmental first party, and the Free Democrats, who are a low-tax, pro-business, libertarian party in some senses. I think it's libertarian with a very small L. So in order for them to agree on something, two things what we know after hearing how they campaigned are going to have to happen. The Greens are going to get their brand new environmental ministry that they want. That is going to be an overarching, huge new ministry to take care of all matters environmental. They're also probably going to want, as the larger of those two parties, a couple of the other pretty plush ministerial posts. The Free Democrats are very likely to say they want the finance ministry. Now, if they get the finance ministry, a lot of the projects that the Greens want to do simply aren't going to be possible because they're not going to allow new taxes. What the Greens want will require new taxes. So this is why I say that I don't want to call it an unholy alliance, but somebody has had to compromise somewhere down the line in order to get that to work. We will not know who has compromised on what until we actually have a government decided. But it does seem at the moment like Olaf Scholz will be the next chancellor. But what type of government he will take over, what type of government he will put together, I beg your pardon, will depend a lot on that arrangement that's being put together between the Free Democrats, the Libertarians, and the Greens. Now, what we also have is, and this is just coming through to me right now as I'm speaking to you, is they're now saying, yes, it looks like a traffic light coalition, but we're still not going to write off anything just yet. So we still could have a Jamaica coalition after all. I think that's highly unlikely. I think the way that the centre-right Conservatives have, I don't want to say turned on one another, but they really have started to already. And they've started the navel-gazing over what went wrong and why did it go so wrong in this last election. I think they have already given up hopes on being in government for the next 4 years. And there's going to be some bloodletting, I would have thought, once this is all done. There are a lot of local elections coming up next year. It'd be quite interesting to see if people like Armin Laschet, who stood as the Chancellor candidate for the Conservatives, if he either bothers to stand or he holds on to his governorship of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. He's not very popular in the polls there at the moment, I can tell you. Very interesting. Peter, thank you for the overview there. I appreciate you being willing to join us. Appreciate the heads up on some of these stories too. No problem. Always good talking with you. Peter Oliver, for those listening. We were just speaking with him. He is the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Follow him on Twitter at PeterG_Oliver_RT. Catch his reporting weekly on RT International. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be taking your calls when we come back. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Again, we'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy.
I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. Lines are open. Anybody wants to call in, now's your best and last chance this morning. And we're into it, 202-521-1320. Jamarl. Yo. Interesting show this morning.
Very interesting show.
Again, I didn't want to put him in too awkward of a position, but we spoke with Peter yesterday for half an hour as well.
Yeah.
But he hit us up with more stories, very interesting stuff.
And completely different stories.
And like you'd said, but as we brought him on, we hadn't spoken to him in a while.
Yeah, it's been several weeks.
I think, we mentioned this yesterday. He got sick with COVID. He was suffering some serious symptoms from that, even though he was vaccinated. And he was saying, not as bad as it could have been based on things he's heard about, but still, he was suffering from it.
Yeah, he said he was mentally foggy, just not, which is kind of scary. I mean, if your job is basically talking and intellectual pursuits, for you to lose that capability is somewhat terrifying.
That is the principal threat.
But this was great conversation. The UK-France thing is phenomenal. Like, that trips me out. It's so petty. Like, it's radically petty. It's like, all right, fine. If you want to give our fishing boats, we're going to cut your power off. You're going to do what? like I said, I was telling you, I kind of want to see them do it just because it's so hysterical.
Everybody likes a cat fight.
Yeah, right? That would be horrible. Yeah, that would be a cat fight, to put it mildly. But you can see it's like all of this damage that Britain is now encountering for Brexit. What does Brexit mean? Well, it seems that Brexit means less power, less petrol, less agricultural items. It means that you're going to slaughter hundreds of pigs because you can't necessarily, for all sorts of snafus associated with this kind of transit back and forth. It means you're at odds with basically the European Union. I mean, even Ireland, Northern Ireland, and, the conflict between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, where even that, I mean, Joe Biden, in one of the conversations that was taking place, the reason I brought up the metric system changeover to the imperial system is because even that, it seems like you're trying too hard to gain favor of the United States because you realize you no longer have the favor of the European Union. And so, these guys are basically desperate for some kind of deal to keep themselves going. And in this case, I remember Joe Biden made the point about Northern Ireland saying, well, hey, look, you can't do anything that's going to screw over the Good Friday Agreement. That's basically a non-starter for any kind of negotiations with the United States. So even in that sense, the closest ally of sorts, there's still conditions upon whatever they're doing. Look, they wanted their autonomy. Fair enough. You got it. And on some level, here are the consequences of doing so. Boris Johnson knew that things weren't going to go well. He got caught in a hype mic a while ago, basically making the point that, it's going to be painful when it first starts and everything else, despite what he was telling the public. And right now, they're in the middle of it.
Well, and Dominic Cummings, I remember seeing an interview where he was getting grilled. This was, Boris Johnson, one of his main political analysts, political lieutenants, basically, the top brass of his campaign, who was talking about how a lot of people, they ran to get they ran to get Boris Johnson. They ran Boris Johnson to get him elected, but they wanted to get rid of him. He wasn't their guy necessarily, but he has sharp political instincts.
Oh, yes, he does.
And he was, he's the one who's, between Trump, Bolsonaro, and Bojo, he's the one who's definitely the strongest.
Oh, man.
Trump's the weakest. Bolsonaro somewhere in the middle. And I say Trump's the weakest. That's probably not true in its own way. But he's gotten kicked off of social media platforms. He's roundly not president anymore, at least for Bolsonaro and Bojo. They're in. Trump may resurrect himself or whatever, but you know what I mean? There were those three populist leaders that were vilified, in some cases for good reason, back in 2016, 2017, that period.
Yeah, but between the three, Boris Johnson is probably the most politically astute of all of them by far.
Maybe.
I mean, Yeah, I would stand by that. I mean, look, I am not a fan of Boris Johnson, and I remember watching him when he was going in the election against Corbyn, when he was pushing back to trying to take power in the prime ministership. I was impressed. I was literally impressed. I mean, like even this notion of Brexit vote and turning the Brexit vote into freedom. Like, it's like, this Brexit vote is freedom and these guys are against freedom. You make a referendum, you need to stand by the referendum. Does he really care about the freedom? No, he doesn't care about the freedom. But because of what was given up by Labour and not necessarily saying, yeah, we're going to stand by the referendum for Brexit, et cetera, he took the space or the vacuum. He occupied the vacuum. And in that case, he had a damning argument in the sense of, are you going to support the referendum or not? And Jeremy Corbyn would get this squeamish answer, well, I mean, we're going to go back and we're going to make a deal with it. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And he's like hitting him over and over and over again on that one particular thing. Yeah. Boris Johnson, when he first took office, one of the first votes, one of his members got up, walked across the aisle and sat down on the other side to get across. You no longer have a governing majority. Like this kind of theatrics of politics where he's watching this stuff take place. He loses 7 votes back to back to back, and the country still backs him to the tune of like 70%. I mean, like, it's extraordinary. They end up having a snap election, and when they have the snap election, he's able to basically take his seats back, including seats from districts that had never been part of the Conservative Party before. Yes. Labour forever. Skinner was like 1,000 years old, and he was able to take that seat from him. And so it's like his political instincts are very, very sharp. And again, this is somebody who's basically a critic of Boris Johnson. Like, whatever clownishness and everything that may be associated with him, he knows his stuff. He may be a liar. Yes, he may be
maybe 100 years old. Maybe 100, not 1,000 years old. Tories and Labour was not around. That was like the Viking takeover.
It's like the guy's a vampire or whatever, just around forever.
Yeah, no.
But his, and again, this is somebody who doesn't even like Boris Johnson.
It's true.
And I found myself like, wow, this guy is phenomenal, because the argument that he was making just worked. It's like, this is about freedom. This is about standing with the public. The public wanted to leave. It doesn't necessarily matter. But there's all this other stuff. And so I'm going to stand on the side with the public, and we're going to have this vote of freedom. It had nothing to do with freedom. He just wanted the ability to cut taxes, cut regulations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Labor gave him the in for it. Oh, yes.
I personally would prefer an imperial system to a metric system. I will fall down on that dispute. I will fall on that sword any day. But we've got a caller, Sydney, calling in from Oregon. Sydney, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
This has been bothering me for a long time, and some of the discussion you've had today has just brought it more to my mind, and I just want to say something that I think is really important, and that is all these decisions that are made without permission. Let's say you don't believe that the virus came from the lab in Wuhan. I can't even say it. Or that some of these things that are happening are not the result of poor decisions being made without our permission. But, when just knowing there's a lab where bioterrorism is being developed, it should make us all completely revolt. I mean, I don't know another word. Revolt's such a strong word, but we should all be absolutely adamantly against these decisions that are made, like Brexit or whatever, that are completely going in the wrong direction.
Wait, but Brexit was voted on. I mean, that was basically a public vote that the public decided to leave.
Yeah, okay, maybe that isn't congruent with what's been bothering me, I guess, about the Wuhan and all that.
I can see how for people on the surface it would be revolting in an emotional sense, but I don't know that it's justification for a literal armed revolt. Mainly because I don't know what the hell actually happened there, and going to the worst assumption, which is that public officials in the United States were in on it, have covered it up from the beginning, that kind of thing. That's a couple of assumptions that I just haven't made yet. And so if I'm reading where you're going there, right, I'm not there. Anyway, we got to close this show out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern. Have a great day, folks. Signing off. See you on the other side.